Hello again, friends, and welcome to a very special episode of the 605 Super Podcast, a special look back at the life and career of Bruno Sammartino, the man known as the living legend, one of professional wrestling's all-time greatest attractions, all-time greatest drawing cards, and someone who reached a level of stardom in the Northeast that very few athletes ever reach. I'm the great Brian Last. I'm very happy to be joined today for this special program by my friend and yours, John McAdam. John, Bruno Sammartino, when I say that name to you, what's the first thing you think?
Honestly, the first thing I think, he's a legend's legend. It's hard to describe to someone not from the Northeast, and I have both a New York and Boston perspective on this, just how huge Bruno was up here. Hogan was like, he was, like a pop star, but Bruno was like, I don't even know how to describe him. He was just, he was like Elvis in a way.
It's weird. When I would meet him at various autograph shows in the 90s, and he was the last guy who refused to sign autographs for money. All of his autographs were free. You could buy a picture, but he wouldn't charge for his autograph. And I always had the feeling around him like he wasn't a wrestler. I never had this with any other wrestler, but I almost felt maybe it was because of the way he conducted himself. Maybe it was because of the way he always had conducted himself. I felt like I was in the presence of a sports legend from the Northeast, like a Mickey Mantle or a Joe Namath, like that level of celebrity to me. Just because of the way he carried himself. And that's one of the unique things about him. And I said this to you off air, but when I was a kid growing up as a wrestling fan, Bruno had already retired. But when people would find out that I was a wrestling fan and talk to me about it, they would bring up Bruno and they would point out that he was real. That he was real. And that's one of his main appeals. You go back and you watch those promos he did. They're unlike any other babyface promos you'll ever see. It's a guy just telling you what's going on. Every now and then he'll speak in some Italian. Every now and then he'd get really fired up, but he was completely believable.
Yeah, he went out there and he would be himself, and I think that was part of what made it work. Bruno's typical interview, and I got to see him like his last year and a half as champion. They would be talking about, some wrestler who Bruno was going to face. Let me just throw Stan Stasiak's name out there. Bruno would come out the first interview, and he'd be, he'd smile, and he'd be giving Stan Stasiak credit for being, a really good wrestler, and he's a very strong man, and it's definitely going to be a tough challenge out there. And then, Vince McMahon would say, hey, Bruno, speak a little Italian, and Bruno would kind of laugh, and he'd speak in Italian. Well, then they'd have the match, and Stan Stasiak would fight dirty. It was almost like Bruno coming in, I'll give this a chance, but it always didn't work out well. Stasiak would fight dirty, and then they would announce a rematch. Well, now you've got Bruno mad, and he would look in that camera, and he would be angry at Stan Stasiak, and he'd tell you exactly what he was going to do to Stan Stasiak, and you just knew Stasiak was in trouble. You just awakened the sleeping giant, and it worked. I mean, Bruno drew like no one else really in the Northeast.
And when you started talking to other wrestling fans, whether it was at school, wherever else, what were their thoughts? Was Bruno the biggest star to everyone?
By far. I mean, and they protected Bruno. I think the whole time I was a fan, and we're talking about I started late 75, started getting into it. I don't believe I ever saw Bruno wrestle on television on a regular match. I think he was strictly the guy who wrestled at the arenas and did interviews to promote those shows.
I can name one match you saw on TV. Bruno and Zbyszko, 1980.
That's true. This was after Bruno had lost the title, and there was something about Bruno. He had that charisma. When they announced, I remember the Saturday afternoon, they said that Bruno had lost the title, and they showed the clips of the match against superstar Billy Graham. And this is going to sound crazy, I was legitimately shaken up for the rest of the day. It was almost unimaginable that Bruno would lose the title, even though I think, logically you got to figure he's going to at some point. I was shocked, and I couldn't get over it like the whole rest of the day. Same thing when Zbyszko turned on him. It was like all I could think about the whole rest of the day. And I know that when you look back, at the buildup of that match, it was so obvious Zbyszko was turning, but I didn't pick up on it. I couldn't, even fathom Larry Zbyszko turning on his mentor like that. And then once again, shaken up at midnight when Bruno announces his retirement, or that his retirement match is coming up. This is like late summer 1981.
We're going to talk a lot on this show about Bruno and Madison Square Garden, but you are someone with a New England background, and a lot of people don't talk as much about Bruno and Boston, but you were there for some of those shows. Talk about Bruno's relationship with the Boston wrestling fans.
I mean, people up here, it was like they lit candles to Bruno. He was like up there with a Ted Williams or a Bobby Orr as far as just fans worshiping him. If you went to Boston, to the Boston Garden, it was a safe idea not to boo Bruno. You could get away with that with Hogan. You could get away with that with Backlund. If you wanted to boo Bruno, you better do it internally because you would get in trouble. Bruno, and a lot of people don't know this, the whole time Bob Backlund was champion at Madison Square Garden, Bruno headlined Madison Square Garden once. It was against Sergeant Slaughter after Slaughter attacked Arnold Skaaland on TV while Backlund was doing a Japan tour. Boston Garden, 70, 79, 80, and 81, apparently Backlund wasn't drawing particularly well in Boston early on. And they, when Bruno came back in late 1978, they started putting him in main events in Boston. And I would say, they didn't completely kick Backlund out, but Bruno was wrestling main events in Boston. I don't think he was wrestling them anywhere else.
Well, that's one of the questions I raise in a conversation we'll hear later on the show, is how do you replace Bruno? And you're not replacing him because he's still around, but if you have a new guy you're trying to elevate to that level, how do you do it when Bruno's still there and Bruno's still the most popular guy, still the biggest drawing card, even if he isn't your champion?
Good question. And I guess the best way to look at it is that, in a sense, the torch had been passed, not directly, but from Bruno to Backlund. And Backlund did, if Bruno went into a match and he lost a match, well, okay, he just lost a match. If Backlund loses, well, the title's on the line. And the title was very important up here. So at least Bob had that going for him. And eventually, I think Bob Backlund always drew well in Madison Square Garden. He got off to a slow start in Boston, but by the end, after Bruno had retired, people were coming out to see both the WWF brand and Bob Backlund.
Of course, Bruno was not very happy when he returned after his 1981 retirement, but he did have some main events in Boston. Did you get to attend any of those?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to have attended the Roddy Piper series and the Randy Savage series, both of which, you look back on that and think about this. We're talking Piper was beginning of 86, Savage was late 86, early 1987. Think about how far removed we are from Bruno being champion. We're looking at 9 or 10 years. And, the product had completely changed. It was, the Hogan WWF was completely different than Bob Backlund WWF. Backlund, despite being champion for almost 6 years, the fans completely turned on him. The last 6 to 12 months he was in the WWF. They never turned on Bruno. Even in the middle of the Hogan era, Bruno could come to Boston. They'd run an angle with Piper, they'd run an angle with Savage, and it would draw. And it would draw better than Hogan. I think Bruno drew a sellout in Boston against Randy Savage, I want to say February 87, and it was the first time the Garden had sold out since 85, and Hogan had been on shows.
Again, I say that. I know Bruno didn't like his post-81 return, but I always thought that was great stuff, the stuff with him and Piper. The angle where after Savage injures Ricky Steamboat and Bruno's back there interviewing him and his face is telling the story. And finally, He can't take it anymore. And he says, "You piece of slime." And he just attacks Randy. Luckily, Hillbilly Jim and a bunch of other people were around him to separate them. I don't know what's going on in that locker room, but it was so good. It was so intense. And you believed Bruno. And there was a reason they were doing that. The reason was Bruno still was a draw. And in many places, he was a more reliable repeat draw than Hogan still, as late as early 87.
Yeah. And like I said, Bruno had to be doing a little math here. I mean, he was in his early 50s, and he kind of looked like a guy who was in really good shape, but he was still in his early 50s, and people were coming out to see him.
You brought up Madison Square Garden. I want to mention a few things here. Scott Teal, a friend of the show, the man behind Crowbar Press, who, of course, put out the great book with J. Michael Kenyon, Wrestling in the Garden, A Battle for New York, Works, Shoots, and Double Crosses, sent along some information from the book just so we could say some actual facts about Bruno and Madison Square Garden. His very first show there, January 2nd, 1960, the main event, Antonino Rocca beat the mighty Zuma. That was a big main event for the time, and it drew over 21,000 people. Bruno made his debut beating Wild Bull Curry on that show. That's in January of 1960. Just 6 months later, June 4th, 1960, he has his first main event in the Garden. Antonino Rocca, the biggest drawing card, the biggest ethnic star in New York, before Bruno, teams with Bruno to beat Pampero Firpo and the great Antonio 2 falls to none. So that's the beginning of Bruno at Madison Square Garden. What was his last main event at Madison Square Garden? July 12th, 1986. The main event, steel cage match, Bruno Sammartino and Tito Santana against Randy Savage and Adrian Adonis. Bruno and Tito won that night. There's been so much talked about with the numbers of Bruno and sellouts and how many shows. Let's actually look at this from a factual point of view. I don't blame anyone who's hung on to the 187 or the 188 numbers because most people don't have the facts, don't have the numbers, don't want to go through the cards and actually count it up. But luckily for me, someone else did because I didn't want to do it either. So here's the actual numbers. Bruno Sammartino had the most appearances in Madison Square Garden in the post-1940 era. Bruno had 159 matches in Madison Square Garden. 159. Just for the record here, number 2 on the list, Pedro Morales with 111. So that's a pretty big drop from 159 to 111. Filling out the list of the top 5, Chief J. Strongbow at 104, Baron Mikel Cicluna with 102, and Gorilla Monsoon with 100 Madison Square Garden appearances. So Bruno has 159 appearances. That we could tell factually is true. The number of sellouts isn't as easy to figure out because what are we basing the gate receipts on? What are we basing it on? Are we basing it on newspaper reports? Some of those are bullshit. So we have to figure out what were sellouts, what weren't. We can figure out for the most part, but some may slip by. What we do know is that the amount of sellouts Bruno had for the 159 appearances he made at Madison Square Garden were in the range, as best we can determine, of 45 times. 45 times in 159 appearances. That's mighty impressive, John.
I agree. And one other thing we want to keep in mind, and I'm certainly not trying to disparage anyone here. Let's say Pedro Morales, Chief J. Strongbow, certainly Baron Mikel Cicluna. How many times were they on the shows at Madison Square Garden, but they were just another guy? They were just another body filling out the card. I mean, that certainly applies to Pedro, like 85, 86, 87. Bruno, not one time was he on the show at Madison Square Garden where he was just another body filling the card.
No. And he was used for important occasions, too. Remember when Pedro won the title in Madison Square Garden, right? A few weeks after Bruno lost the title.
3 weeks.
Pedro wins the title 3 weeks later. It's Bruno in his suit who runs out there, congratulates Pedro in the ring, raises his hand, endorses him. That was important. They had to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Bruno absolutely had to endorse the new champion, and we've seen this in wrestling before, but and we've seen it since. But I mean, Bruno, above all else, telling the people at Madison Square Garden that, yeah, I'm behind this guy, I support this guy, was very, very important.
We mentioned Bruno's first run in Madison Square Garden, his first show there, January 2nd, 1960. His first main event there, June 4th, 1960. Well, let's go back to the very beginning. A few weeks back on the Super Podcast, we had a chance to speak to Don Leo Jonathan, one of the great legends of professional wrestling history, one of the great giants in professional wrestling history. And he mentioned Bruno Sammartino. I wanted to know, he was there at the very beginning, who was more popular at their peak in New York, Antonino Rocca or Bruno Sammartino? You got to witness Rocca at his peak. You also got to see Bruno Sammartino at his peak in the same area in the Northeast. How would you compare the two in terms of popularity?
Sammartino was much more popular as time went by. There was a time when I was in New Jersey at an arena the first time they introduced Bruno.
Really?
Yeah, and Rocco was already a seasoned veteran. So he came a little later, Bruno did. But as far as popularity overall during the run of time, Bruno was much more talked about than Rocco. You ask any Italian in New York who was the best wrestler in the world,
yeah,
it was Sammartino.
They still say that to this day. Many people in New York.
Well, they got good reason to.
Bruno quickly establishes himself in New York as a major drawing card and a major star. After he gets blackballed by Vince McMahon Sr., he ends up in Toronto for Frank Tunney. He does the exact same thing. Before you know it, he's back in New York, and this is a very interesting time. It's the beginning of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. It's the end of Buddy Rogers' power in the wrestling business. And here's Bruno. Here's the next great ethnic babyface who will turn out to be the greatest ethnic babyface in professional wrestling history. And Bruno comes in, and before you know it, Buddy Rogers is gone, and Bruno Sammartino's the champion, and everything is working out perfect for Vince McMahon Sr. It leaves the NWA. Everything's working out. And Bruno has a lot of big opponents. And he has a lot of big matches at Madison Square Garden. And in 1964, a new babyface shows up to be his friend, to team up with him. And that babyface is Cowboy Bill Watts, just a few years into his wrestling career. Well, I was very fortunate to have a chance to speak to Cowboy Bill Watts about this, and also about the fact that while he was Bruno's friend and tag team partner, he was also the first babyface to turn on Bruno Sammartino, and boy did he have a lot of heat. And he also had 4 main events at Madison Square Garden against Bruno. Let's go to Cowboy Bill Watts right now. As we continue our look at the life and career of Bruno Sammartino, I am very happy to have on the show today one of his most famous opponents. Famously a tag team partner of his, and then 4 huge matches at Madison Square Garden. And that, of course, is the Oklahoma Stampeder himself, Cowboy Bill Watts. Welcome to the program today.
Well, thank you, Brian.
You know, I mentioned that you are one of Bruno's most famous opponents, and I think a lot of fans probably don't realize the run you had in New York, in the Northeast, in the mid-'60s with Bruno. So before we talk about you and Bruno, let's set that up a little bit. How did you first get into New York at the beginning of '64? Because you'd only been wrestling a few years at that point.
Right. Yeah, I started in 1962, so that was early. I was wrestling for Leroy McGurk Championship Wrestling, Inc., and I was wrestling in Joplin, Missouri. And an old superstar, Wild Red Berry, was home. His wife, Lil, used to do the census up in Pittsburgh, Kansas. And Red was home with her at that time, and Red was managing the Kangaroos or other people for back in New York. And Red was a huge star. I mean, he was a megastar clear back with Danny McShane and guys like that. He was really quite a story. I mean, some of these stories are just amazing with how these guys survived and the things they went through. But anyway, so Red was there, and Leroy booked him on the card and booked me as his tag team partner because Red was up in years, and Leroy knew that he couldn't do much in the ring, but he would have a big draw to the people. And the promoter there was a guy named Bob Clay, who was an old-fashioned promoter who didn't believe in putting a live TV show in there. Figure that out. I mean, some of these guys' brains, I don't know what they even think about. But
Yeah.
Here we are, he didn't have, but he had on the local news, he had a segment, and so when we were in Joplin, he advertised on the local news. So Wild Red Berry was there, and like I say, I was there, and we got a little smiles going with the guys that we were going to wrestle that night at the Joplin Civic Center or auditorium or whatever it was. And it was wild and woolly, and Red loved it. Red loved it, the fact that here I am, brand new in the business and already setting up a schmoz, you know, and so he was really impressed by that. And it drew very, very well, and the match went great and all this, and I got to visit with him a little bit. I was impressed by getting to visit with him, and because he was a big star. But so anyway, he went back, unbeknownst to me, and he told Vince and Toots Mondt and all of them back in New York about me. So I was wrestling in a 4-H barn in Wichita Falls, Texas, that didn't even have a phone. The same promoter that promoted Joplin used to promote Wichita Falls, Texas. So it was a 4-H barn that didn't even have a phone. And the police came and got me and told me I had an emergency call. My gosh, I thought maybe something had happened to my parents. I just couldn't imagine why I would be getting this emergency call.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It was Vince and Vince McMahon and Toots Mondt. This is Vince Sr. And because Vince Jr. at that time was in college. So anyway, I get this phone call, and they tell me that Wild Red Berry, blah, 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 blah. And I'm to start on, this was a Thursday, and I'm to start on Washington, D.C. TV, which is where they taped their big television show that went into New York. I'm to start there next Thursday. And naive as I was, I said, well, I'll have to ask Mr. McGurk. They said, we'll take care of Mr. McGurk. You just be here. So the next day I went into the office in Tulsa, and I told Leroy about the call, and he already knew about it. And he said, this is a huge opportunity for you. You're going to go. And so he laid it all out for me. To make a long story short, I went there, and that's how it all started. And then, here I am, a guy that, I'm just barely in the business and don't think I know much. And I'm sure there's a lot that would agree. But anyway, I get up there, and of the guys I met, Killer Kowalski was a star then. And, of course, Bruno Sammartino and Gorilla Monsoon were in the middle of a big program. And it was just an awesome thing. And I didn't understand much about what all was going on up there. But Bruno Sammartino and I hit it off because he could see I was working out on the weights and was really, really strong. And so we started working out on the weights together. And I just thought I was strong. I mean, here you are with a guy that could bench press more than anybody in the world at that time, but nobody would count it because he was a professional. Back in that day, they didn't count what a pro did. Matter of fact, I had a friend of mine that got kicked off the Olympic team as a sprinter. He was the world champion sprinter in a quarter mile because he accepted a wristwatch. That's how strict the Olympics was back then.
Yeah.
And you see where it is today. But anyway, to make a long story short, Bruno and I started working out on the weights together. And my gosh, my bench press just went crazy. I mean, I'd never had anything like this. And so that's when I first started hitting 500 pounds and moving on up on the bench press. And matter of fact, I ended up in one year working out there, did 585 pounds, which at that time was the most anybody had done in bench press, except for Bruno Sammartino. And at some of those deals when we'd work out in New York City, he was a guy that believed in big repetitions. He didn't believe in the short repetition sets, and neither did I. And I think that's what kept us from injuries, because we would start low and work all the way up and do high repetitions. So we'd work all the way up to our maxes and do some singles with those. But we would start out doing 3 sets of 10 with 2 1/4 on the bench press. 3 sets of 10 at 2 1/4. And then we'd go on up in increments. And then we'd come back down. Well, then Bruno sometimes he could get you psychologically. I mean, this guy was a great competitor. He'd go over and to the incline bench and take 150-pound dumbbells and start doing incline flies. Are you kidding me? Get out of here. Or one day we're doing the bench presses and we've gone up, and like I say, I was hitting up over the 550 and getting up there, and we went up and we worked all the reps. We tried to always do at least 100 repetitions in our bench press workout, and we got up there and we worked up and we worked down, and Bruno said, "Okay, now let's go back to 2 1/4." He said, let's do 3 sets of as many reps as we can. Well, I'm shocked. He does 10. I did about 6. He does another 10. I did about 3. He does another 10. I'm so blown now I could only get another 1. So, I mean, that's another thing he would do. I mean, he was just a powerful guy. But also in the process, I got to know him and he got to know me. And this guy was an honorable guy. He was a man's man. He was honest. His word was his bond. And like I say, he mentored me in so many ways that it's just unbelievable. I'll never forget that I thought I was not getting a fair amount of pay on the deal. Like every wrestler thinks. No wrestler ever thinks he's getting a fair amount of pay based on the draw of the house.
Right.
But then no wrestler's paying the bills. He doesn't even have a clue what it costs to put that show on. He doesn't have a clue what it costs for television or anything else. All he looks at is the house and thinks he is getting screwed. And yeah, you may be. You may be not getting as much as they could give you. But so I was going to leave and go back home. And Bruno said, so you think Leroy McGurk pays you fair? And I said, well, he pays me a lot more fair than they do here. So what were you making a week? Now, you got to realize this is back in an era. When I got the business, my economics professor at Oklahoma University had told us that we were making $25,000 a year. We were wealthy. That's what the economy was. If you could make $25,000 a year, you were wealthy. So, all right, back home, I'm making, $300-400 a week, sometimes $500 a week. But gasoline was 17 cents a gallon. The downtown Grady Manning Hotel was less than $5 a night. A buffet that all you could eat was $1.25. A six-pack was $1.25. So if you were making $40-50 a night, $60, $70 a night, you were putting money in the bank. Well, so Bruno said, so now what are you making back home? I told him. He said, now what are you making here? And I said, $1,500, $1,400, a couple thousand every now and then. So he said, but you're not getting paid fair, so you want to go back there where you think Leroy McGurk is paying you fair, and that's where you want to work. And I thought, it doesn't make much sense, does it? He said, well, not to me, but he said, I don't know how you guys from Oklahoma figure your math. So, I mean, he had a way of mentoring you. And so then they teamed us with him, us together a lot. And I'll tell you one thing about it. He could have commanded whatever he wanted, but he shared the income because he was the big draw. They put me with him to establish as a team, and then when they bring the new hot heel in, the final guy the new hot heel had to wrestle was me, and then he'd beat me, he'd be ready for Bruno. So it was kind of a process back there that worked like a charm for them. I mean, it worked like a charm. And so that's what he did, and the top guy, would go against me. So we did that, and I got a lot of benefits out of it. I mean, heck, I got to appear with Bruno in tag matches in the Garden and everywhere else, and all this. But as we went through this process with a lot of guys, and I'll tell you actually how I got over back east was Vince booked me against Killer Kowalski in Washington D.C., and we went to a 20-minute draw. And that 20-minute draw, because Kowalski was a vegetarian, and his conditioning was unbelievable, and he was nonstop. And so that big draw, because I could stay with him, I was young and I was in shape. That draw, they saw it tore the place down, and Kowalski just had such a tenacious style. That's what made me a star, and they booked me in Kowalski everywhere. And that's what got me over in New York. So again, as I moved on up, it became Bruno's partner. And then there was an inner office deal back then. One guy in the business Bruno hated with a passion was a guy named Buddy Rogers. He'd been a huge star all over the United States. But Buddy was a fabulous showman, but Buddy was a treacherous guy. And so he pulled some things on Bruno, and then Bruno got so mad, Bruno slammed him on the steps and beat the crap out of him. So Bruno got suspended, and he couldn't work anywhere. Back then, the commissions had such power, he could not work anywhere. His wife was sick, and she was in the hospital and having to have different things done. And I mean, so Bruno was in dire straits, and he had to come back and apologize to Buddy Rogers and to be able to work again. And he hated it. But this time he went around to all the commissions, and he sent all of them a letter of notice, and he gave his notice and he left, and he went to Toronto for Frank Tunney. And Frank Tunney, he got over up there. I mean, this guy's a legitimate. He's real Italian for one thing, and the Italians loved him, and he got over. And in the fight and in the gripe, Vince was telling Tunney that he was not worthy, that he was this and he was that and the other. And he talked Tunney into where Tunney started having him beat. So, and Bruno did his jobs. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. And yet the people still loved him. And Tunney finally said, wait a minute, I'm crazy. This kid is doing everything I've asked. And so Tunney quit knocking him off. And so then Bruno got over so strong. I mean, he got over so strong that he was selling out up there. Well, in the meantime, Rogers was trying to pull a maneuver on Vince, where he ended up with part of the territory, he and a guy named Ray Fabiani. And so they had a big thing going. And so there was a lot of crap going on. And Rogers knew he had him kind of by the short hair, so to speak. And so anyway, the bottom line is Vince came up and talked Bruno into coming back to New York. And he really needed him in New York. And so, but when Bruno came back, one caveat he made was he told Vince if he had to work with Buddy Rogers, he was going to go over right in the middle, 1, 2, 3, and if Buddy Rogers gave him any crap, he was going to beat the crap out of him. I mean, he hated Buddy Rogers that bad. So to make a long story short, he came back and he went over Buddy Rogers in Madison Square Garden in 43 seconds, and Buddy thought it would kill the town. And then Vince would have to have him back. But it didn't, because they brought Monsoon out, and Bobby Davis was Monsoon's manager, and all Bobby did was make the promos, and Monsoon was a Manchurian giant, and Monsoon got over like $1 million. So the bottom line is this thing just kept on going. And that's what happened. Well, then I get there, and they've had all this success, and I'll be darned if still that temptation and that old friendship Vince had with Buddy's watching me get over, and he decides, well, let's do a deal where I come out of retirement and I'll manage Cowboy Bill Watts, and he'll double-cross Bruno, and he'll make all this money. So that really appealed to Vince. And the go-between they had me was Wild Red Barry, because Wild Red knew Buddy and he brought me. So they had Wild Red Barry set up the deal with Buddy to introduce me to Buddy. Now, I'm dumb and don't have a clue what's happened at this point. But anyway, I get there and I get to meet Buddy, and he's good at whining and dining you and showing you the stars and everything else. I mean, you know, he was a huge star, and here I'm a young nobody. So I went there, and then he's laying all this out. Well, when he's laying all this out, what I do know is how bad Bruno Sammartino hates him. And Bruno has been a friend to me, a mentor to me, and has put me in a position to make a lot of money without requiring anything of me. And it really bothered me. So I went and privately told Bruno. The problem being was we couldn't really talk about it or let them know that I had told him. And Bruno said, okay, I can handle that. Don't worry. And what he did is he sent his fan club manager, who's a friend of Buddy's wife, down there, and she talked to him, and naturally she told her all about it. So that way Bruno could confront Vince and say, look, that's not our deal, and that's not the deal I'm going for. So this is really high intrigue, I want to tell you. It's more than anything I've ever been in. So bottom line is that's what came about on this thing. And in the meantime, Bruno and I got to put together a deal. I said, well, look, I can make the most money I can make is if I wrestle you. And that's when we came up with the angle to have me double-cross Bruno Sammartino and go against him. It was out of that friendship. And so there was just so much. Now, I left New York after I had my run. I always like to leave while I'm still on top. So I put over the people I need to put over to do business the way it should be done, and I left New York. And Vince had always figured, and I'd always figured I'd come back at the right time. But that just never worked out. My life was on a different path. And that's fine. I mean, I didn't know that. It wasn't a path that I was designing, like that I was designing this path. It just, that's the way it was going. And so I went to work for Shires, and then from Shires I went with Gagne. And every guy I went to, I learned so much under them. And I learned the things I liked, and I learned the things I didn't like. And people said, they always knew I was going to end up with a promotion. I did not know that. You know, I wasn't thinking. It's not like I was in this business and that this game plan was my plan all along. It wasn't. But the growth was there, and I got to work with everybody. Another thing that happened with me is that I didn't just draw money in New York. Every single place I went to, every single territory, they used to call it in those days, that I went to, I drew money. And so that didn't happen for everybody. There's a lot of guys who got over in one area and never got over in another area. You know, so I had that uniqueness that just worked out, you know, in that way. But that's what had happened. And so then Bruno and I never did see each other much after that. But the one or two times we did see each other, you know, with a friendship like Bruno's, it's not high maintenance. When he's your friend, he's your friend. And I'm the same way. And so when we did see each other, we could take up and talk and laugh, just like we'd always been together. And then one time, at a critical time, when we were having the, quote, war in Georgia, and Eddie Graham had given me part of the Georgia promotion to come in there and to star and the help of the booking and the television and everything else. And it was going to lead to Eddie Graham and I working together in Florida later. They did a smart thing. They reached out and they got Vince to give them Bruno to come into Atlanta for a big show against us. And I called Bruno and told him what we just caught up on the phone. Told him where I was and what I was doing. He said, then he said, I'm booked there. And I said, I know you are. He said, is that what you're calling me about? You want to ask me not to go? I said, no, I would never do that. Because I know your word is your bond and you've already committed. I'm just telling you where I am. And he questioned me all about the thing. And I said, this is the deal and this is what's happening. And that's all I wanted you to know is where I am. Well, the kind of guy Bruno is, there's a friend of his. Now, I realize we haven't been around each other in years. And he said, well, I'm going to come there because I promised him I will. I said, I expected you to. He said, I won't come back. Well, I'm going to tell you, that was a hell of a deal. They got a sellout, but they didn't have him on a regular basis. Vince couldn't have really given him up on a regular basis anyway. You know, I mean,
yeah.
Vince, because Bruno was too important to New York, but Bruno came. That's the kind of friend he was. The kind of friend that if the friendship means something, and that's the kind of guy Bruno Sammartino is and was. So when I heard he passed, you start thinking, no way. I mean, this guy's a stud. He's going to live forever. He takes care of himself. You know, everything else. You know, that he would have been the last guy that I would have ever thought would pass away. You know, yet here I'm 78. He was what, 82? You know, so, you know, I'm in that same bubble. I mean, guys in our age and younger, but you know, it really, and I know his wife, Carol, I mean, he loved her. They've been together forever. And here she is, and her health was so, from my understanding, was so touch and go with when he's younger. And now she's outlived him as far as I know. I haven't talked to Carol either. I don't know what, you may know more about what actually was the medical cause. I don't know what the cause was as far as him passing away, but I want to tell you, it hit me, and I wrote a little something about it and sent it out to my friends. You know, I'm not real involved in social media and stuff like that, but Bruno Sammartino was a stud, and he was a stud of the old-fashioned venue where, you know, his word was good and you could count on him. And that's the kind of guy he was. And I can't say enough good about him. And I mean, there was just a lot of different things. You know, there's so many stories I could relate to if we got back. You know, he knew Sinatra and Jilly Rizzo. These guys really liked him. I mean, the top Italian stars loved Bruno Sammartino. You know, that's just how it was. I mean, I got to meet guys I would have never met because I was his friend. And he was just unassuming about all that.
Well, when it comes to his popularity, I'm curious your thoughts as to how big he was. I mean, you were there. You were the booker when Dusty Rhodes turned babyface, a major moment. You were the man behind the Junkyard Dog's rise in popularity. You were still partners with Fritz when Kerry and the Von Erichs really took off. Those are examples of guys who really just transcended with popularity. How would you compare Bruno Sammartino's popularity in the Northeast when you were there to their popularities later?
I think it's really pretty simple. You mentioned when we started this broadcast that I had 4 matches with Sammartino headlining the Garden, right? Well, I think probably at all the main events in the Garden, maybe I had 4, 5, or 6. I think there was a couple of tag team main events and blah, blah, blah. I don't remember the exact sequence. So let's say I had 5 or even maybe 6 times that I was a headliner in Madison Square Garden, which Madison Square Garden, no matter what, was the mecca of sports at that time, was the mecca. And as a matter of fact, I was the first guy that broke the mainstream media line when Vince got a deal where they did the Saturday Evening Post did a big story on me called The Rich Full Life of a Bad Guy, because I was a heel in New York. And they had a guy named Myron Cope from Pittsburgh who was with me for 7 days to write the story. Matter of fact, Myron is the guy, my understanding is he's the guy that came up with the idea of the terrible towel in Pittsburgh for the Steelers. So anyway, that's how big it was, and how big that stardom was for me was that made me a national star with all that publicity and everything out of New York. Okay, so we've established my credentials in the Garden. Bruno Sammartino headlined Madison Square Garden 187 times, I believe. 187 times he was the main event. Now, give that a perspective, and I think you have just answered your own question. I think you have just answered your own question.
Yeah, no one had that longevity. How big a star
was he? That's right. Well, that was, yes, longevity. You're 100% right. But again, the big thing about how big a star he was is that tells you right there. That tells you. I mean, he was a huge star, and again, he was a star. I mean, this guy I never heard him complain about, he got hurt several times. I one night in the Garden, we had a deal where it was a Texas death match, which turned out to be another return, because we understood the mechanics. And so in a Texas death match, there's no disqualification. No count out, nothing. I mean, if you lose, you lose. Well, we did a thing in that deal where I ended up kicking him in the testicles, and the referee and the commissioner came in and disqualified him, which played perfectly into what we wanted, because it gave us a whole nother match. So these were some of the things that were happening, and that's just how big it was. You got to realize this is back when people took their wrestling seriously. I'll never forget Sting one time told me, said, "Well, Bill, the business has changed a lot since you were out of it." I said, "Yeah, you guys don't have to fight your way to the ring or from the ring."
Yeah, that's right.
I said, because I said, you guys have given the business away.
But on that topic, here you are, and Bruno had a lot of big opponents, big heels that he wrestled against, but that wasn't you.
That's right.
You were his friend, and you turned on him. What was that of heat like for you in the Northeast?
It was unbelievable. It was the heat was so intense. As a matter of fact, some of the things that I did back then, you could not do today. My heat when I wrestled Bobo Brazil in Washington, D.C. was so intense. I mean, I'm lucky I didn't get killed. I was so young and dumb. The things I said then, you couldn't even say today. You couldn't say them on television. And Myron Cope was with me when I went in against Bobo in Washington, D.C. And he wanted to feel what it felt like to be at ringside when this thing happened. And well, by the time it took 40 policemen to get me to ringside. Now this after I turned on Bruno, and Bobo, you could have a sellout with Bobo. Generally, you got one match with Bobo, but Bobo another super guy, and Bobo had a belief in me. And so Bobo and I had this thing in there, and anyway, it took 40 policemen to get me to the ring. They ended up putting a wire, like a fence wire screen over the entryway where I came, so the people had urinated in buckets and threw their urine on me. Took 40 people to get me to the ring. And Myron Cope tells me, he's with me, he said, "Bill, get the police to take me back." He said, "They're going to kill you tonight." Well, and let me say this. Bobo was such a good guy. And here I am, this young guy in the business. And I went and talked to Bobo before the match. And I said, "Bobo, I got a way, you always get one match for the guy and you go over right in the middle." And I said, "That's generally that guy's run." I said, "I got a way where we could get 2 or 3 matches out of this deal." He said, "Yeah, Cowboy?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Tell me." And I told him. And he said, "Wow, that's a good idea." He said, "That's money." I said, "That's money." I said, "We can get 2 or 3 matches out of this, whatever it needs to be. The ending will still be the same. You will still be the guy." He said, "Okay, Cowboy." And I said, "Vince is not going to listen to me as young as I am. He will listen to you because you're his star." He said, "Yeah, but Cowboy, I could never explain this to him. I don't know how to explain this to him." So he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll get Vince in here." He said, "I'll start talking to him. You be in there in the bathroom, and I'm going to call you in to explain it to him." And that's what he did. And we ended up getting three matches out of this run with Bobo and I in Washington, D.C. Now, you got to remember how bad this was. This was when the Equal Rights Amendment had been signed. Yeah. And the racism was really big, and the blacks had rioted and were burning Washington, D.C.
Yeah, this is 1965 we're talking.
Right. And yet I would be down in the black area eating barbecue and drinking beer. And the cops would say, "Are you crazy? They're going to kill you." I said, "They hate me in the ring, but they're wrestling fans. They love me as a wrestler. And I'm down here with some of the toughest guys, some of the toughest black guys I know, and I don't have to worry about anything. I'm having a ball." That's just how it was. I mean, there was a way, and I didn't understand all the ramifications that was going on then, but you know, I already knew that I hated racism. That I hated the fact, and I thought that racism was based on ignorance. That when you take and condemn a whole group of people based on their skin color, or based on something like being Jewish, or something, I just find that has to be complete evil. It's complete evil, and it's complete ignorance.
Yeah.
And I could never get there. I just couldn't get there. And so anyway, the bottom line is that Bobo and I got those matches out of it. And then that's how hot it was. That's how hot that angle was. I know that I was dating who became my wife at the time, and we had to go to some town outside New York City. The angle had already played, and I was in a tag match with Bruno at that night because it was already booked. We had to follow through with those. So, of course, we went to the ring, and then I turned around and walked out on him and left him there again. And I had told her, I said, when the promoter brings me out of the dressing room, do not acknowledge me, do not look at me, don't do anything. Just head for the door I'm heading for so we can get outside, because they would always set it up for the main event. Could get out and they put a tag match or something on last to give you time to get out.
Yeah.
So anyway, I said, we will get out, but don't look at me, don't do anything. I'll be darned if she didn't look at me, and they mobbed her, and I had to go battle my way in to get her and pull her out. Scared her to death. So I mean, yeah, there was some tremendous heat. And it was, yeah, and let me just say this, that deal in Washington, D.C. with Bobo, when they did riot that night, because I went over it, and he'd never lost there. And they were coming in the ring, opening up knives, saying, "We'll cut him for you, Bobo." And Phil Zacco, bless his heart, Phil Zacco was watching everything and realized that they'd overrun the 40 policemen. The 40 policemen were totally overrun. and they couldn't get me out. And the people were gathered at the dressing room where I had to go. And Phil Zacco caught my eye in all this. I was hoping a rope would drop down out of the ceiling. Or, you start thinking, gee, where's my mother? I was, the craziest thoughts, because this thing was an out-of-control riot. And I mean, you're talking, you've never been in a deal, so you've been in the focal point of an out-of-control riot. I mean, with the numbers, because if you ever get off your feet, they're going to hammer you into the middle of next year. So anyway, that's what I was doing, and Phil Zacco got my eye, and he signified me to go the other way, because the dressing room was cut off. So I made the move for the other way. And I think I put 17 or 18 people in the hospital that night. And I mean, Phil said, my gosh, you were hitting men, women, anybody. I said, Phil, I didn't have time to check health cards and IDs. Anybody that was got in between me and where I was trying to go, I hit them. I mean, this thing was out of control.
You got to keep moving.
It was out of control. Yes. And see, Johnny Valentine had told me way back. I mean, some of the old timers, they used to educate you in all this because they went through it. They knew what you were going to do if you were a big heel. And Johnny Valentine said, you go through the crowd, and he said, you keep your arms swinging, and you're looking both ways. And he said, if one guy stands his ground like he's going to take you on, when you get to him, go around him. I said, go around him. He said, yeah, as soon as you hit him, you lit the fire. You have lit the fire as soon as you hit him. So go around him. And he'll just be standing there like, what just happened? What just happened? And so, you learn so much. And you tell the policeman, say, look, you're taking me to the ring and from the ring. Do not grab my arms for anything. Under no condition, grab my arms. If you grab my arms, I'm going to be hitting you. I will keep my arms moving. I'm going to be moving to that ring. And you had to get in and you had to get out. And the time to get out was right then, right when the finish was over. Fred Blassie was a hot heel. And we were on an outdoor show in New Jersey. And I'll be damned, the police and them kept him in the ring after the finish. My guess, they almost got him killed because that let the crowd gather. And the next thing you know, they're starting to sail those metal chairs. They're throwing the damn metal chairs. And Fred Blassie's stuck in the ring. And he's cussing them out, because you got to get out right now today. Back in the day. Not now, because, everybody.
No one has heat.
That's the problem. They don't know what heat is today.
Yeah.
They've never experienced it. And that's the kind of things that you went through. And there was some, they try to get your car. I came out of a show in South Norwalk, Connecticut, and they're trying to rock my car to turn it over. And I had to fight my way there and knock them off the car. My tag partner at that time was a guy named Smasher Sloan. So, we had some crazy times, man. There was a riot in West Hempstead, Long Island, and it was my first lawsuit. But I was fighting for my life, and I had to go to trial. And the office hired this guy to represent me that wanted, back then, $750 just to go to my arraignment. I said, hell, I can go to my own arraignment. All I got to do there is plead not guilty.
Yeah.
I'm not paying you $750 to go to an arraignment. So anyway, the office kind of got upset with me because he was their pick. But that was crazy. So what I did do while I was up there, I got to know the police and stuff that worked our matches, and I started asking around as who was the best criminal defense lawyer up there, and they pointed me to a guy. He said, this guy tries the cases. He doesn't just make, so many lawyers, they're good at compromising, but they don't go to court. Well, hell, I didn't want to pay them. So I got this, I went and told this guy my story of what had happened, and he took the case, and he was really, really good. So we went to court on the thing, we had to, and we won the case. Because they had, the thing of it is, the guy was nowhere near his seat. He'd run and tried to jump me as I went back into the dressing room.
Well, that's always what it is, isn't it? That the heel wrestler just beats up the innocent fan for no reason. They're just sitting there minding their own business, behaving perfectly.
Yeah, Yeah. I had another one down in Florida that was hilarious. We won't go into that now, but you're exactly right. And only this gal, her family was trying to sue me because she'd had some kind of stroke or something, and she had cut me. She had cut me with a small knife or fingernail file or something. And all I'd done is I felt it get me, and I reached back around. And when I reached back around, I grabbed her, and I didn't even know I was moving toward the dressing room, and I swung it, and she was so tiny it threw her against the concrete wall. And then so the next thing you know, it's like, oh my gosh, I did all this stuff to destroy her life, and they wanted me to pay for her. The home that they needed to keep her in, and all, yeah, that was a whole other story. And it had a funny ending, though. It had a tremendously funny ending. But, and we won it because the judge was a very smart judge, and he tried it in his chambers. And that's another story for another time. But anyway, so you went through a lot. You learned a lot of things about life and about business and about the world. But you see, you got to be around guys that had spent their life in the business, and they would teach you. And Bruno Sammartino, again, was just a phenomenal human being, and I'm sure all of Pittsburgh is mourning, all the wrestling world is mourning, because he was one of those guys that surpassed, and as we said, 187 times. Are you kidding me? The headliner of the Garden? I don't think anybody's ever done that or ever will do that.
It's a shame that Bill Watts never did get to go back and have another run there at some point in the 70s. It would have been really interesting based on their history, him going back in there. But as he said in that interview, his life was on a different path. And he did so many other things in wrestling. He never did get to go back to New York and wrestle Bruno again. But he is one of Bruno's all-time most famous opponents. John, when you think of Bruno feuds, when you think of Bruno opponents, what kind of feuds come to mind?
Well, first of all, I would have loved to have seen the Bill Watts, his turn and his series against Bruno. I think Bill Watts is one of the greatest, not only one of the greatest baby faces of all time, one of the greatest heels of all time. I mean, Bill knew how to talk. He was a big guy. He knew how to be condescending, and he just had that attitude about him. So I would have loved to have seen that.
Ray Morgan hated him. From what I understand, after he turned heel, Ray Morgan legitimately didn't like him anymore.
Oh, right. I think Ray's getting a little bit caught up in things, but that's okay. The first real Bruno feud I ever saw that I remembered was Superstar Billy Graham in late 1975 into early 1976. Graham was a guy we all know. He had a ton of charisma, but he was like something we'd never seen before. He was this bodybuilder who you'd look at and you'd say, okay, this guy can match Bruno in the strength department, which we had some guys that you look at and say, maybe, but probably not. You looked at Graham and you said, no, this guy's probably stronger than Bruno. And Graham had so much else going on for him that, I was too young to go to the Boston Garden and see it, but I would certainly go to bed at night dreaming about being able to see it. Another great feud, Spiros Arion. This is in 1975. He had such a great heel arrogance about him. He was just such a nasty person, or at least it seemed like it on TV, and you wanted to go to the arena and just see Bruno shut this guy's mouth and cave his head in, because he was, again, just such a nasty person on TV. Another great one, obviously, is Stan Hansen from 1976. We're actually hoping that this show drops on April 26th of 2018, which is the 42nd anniversary of the match where Stan Hansen dropped Bruno on his head and legitimately broke his neck. Life was a dangerous place for Stan Hansen in the Northeast after that. People were legitimately coming after him because he had done serious harm to Bruno. That led to the big Shea Stadium match in 1976, and then they had a sellout steel cage match at Madison Square Garden. Bruno and Hansen also did sellouts in Boston, and they actually came back with a tag team match to start it off. It was Ivan Putski and Bruno Sammartino against Stan Hansen and Ivan Koloff, which definitely sounds like a fun match. Yeah. Another underrated feud, I think, with Bruno. He wrestled Nikolai Volkov in 1974 and then again in 1976. But then in 1979, when Bruno was in an announcer's role and obviously no longer champion, they did an angle where Nikolai Volkov and Fred Blassie attacked him on TV. Once again, instant box office. This feud was the second match down at Madison Square Garden, but they did I want to say two main events in Boston. And then, of course, I would say probably the best Bruno feud of all was the one with Larry Zbyszko. And again, I mentioned this earlier. I was young and I did not see this coming. It was a feud. I don't even know what feud you could really compare Bruno versus Zbyszko to, because there was so much psychology and it was actually deep and detailed. Larry comes out on TV and he says, one week Bruno wants to interview him and Larry walks away and they're like, oh, I guess Larry didn't hear Bruno calling for him or something. And then they do an interview with Larry where he's like, look, I'm tired of living in Bruno's shadow. I'm tired of people saying, hey, there goes little Bruno. I need to have a match against Bruno Sammartino. Bruno initially refuses. Larry threatens to retire if he doesn't get his match. So Bruno eventually accepts, but he says, I'm not going to try to hurt Larry. Well, they go into the ring, and you got to understand, this is Larry Zbyszko's his most important moment in his career, and Bruno's treating it like a workout. And I think the average person can see why Larry Zbyszko got pissed. And you see him getting more and more frustrated and angry as the match goes on. Not only is Bruno not taking this terribly seriously, but Larry can't touch him. Bruno's just better than this guy. And then Larry eventually snaps and hits him with the chair. And like I said, you come out of it saying, I don't blame Zbyszko for being pissed, even though he overreacted. And then as the weeks went on, Larry just, became more and more heelish. And they threw in what I thought was an interesting little ingredient into that feud. When Larry Zbyszko would wrestle on TV after the turn, Bruno and Vince McMahon would be doing commentary, and Bruno would refuse to speak, and he let it be known, I have nothing to say about Larry Zbyszko. And Vince McMahon would just do commentary by himself, and Bruno would sit there silently. So I thought that was a great feud, and at the end where they have the cage match at Chase Stadium, and Bruno wins, and Larry walks up and raises Bruno's hand.
And Bruno kind of shoves him away.
Yeah, Bruno kind of brushes him off, but Larry's like, hey, the better man won. And usually, obviously, the heels don't do that. They just sit there and whine. Not this time.
Well, it really elevated Larry. Like you said, it really was the most important moment of his career, not just because his hair was in much better shape than it was during his Tony Garea tag team days, but he had been a mid-card guy at best. He had been a guy, he had the tag team title run with Tony Garea, but he wasn't really a top-of-the-card guy, and this thing with Bruno instantly elevated him there, and it's a shame that he did leave the Northeast pretty quickly because he never did get a run with Backlund or really get to do much else, but Bruno successfully elevated Larry. No one didn't believe that Larry should be in those matches with Bruno after the angle.
You know what? The one thing I would have changed about that angle, Larry should have been showing some improvement on television. Like, just give him a throwaway win against, like, Johnny Valiant or Bobby Duncombe or something on television. Because, like I said, for me watching it, I thought it was just going to be as simple as, okay, well, Larry just demonstrated that he's not in Bruno's league when they did the match against him. So if you're going to see Zbyszko versus Bruno Sammartino, you're basically going just to see Larry get his ass kicked and getting what he deserves.
That really was towards the end of Bruno's career because that's 1980. He retires by 81. Of course, he does have a lawsuit against the WWF and Vince McMahon or Capitol Wrestling. I forget exactly who it was against, but it was for a number of things, including, I believe, he was upset that he wasn't getting paid any of the money that was coming in for when HBO aired the MSG shows in the 70s. Was one of the things I recently read in an interview with Bruno about that. But they bring him back in 84 as things start going with the national expansion, and they make him the color commentator. He instantly lends credibility, and he's instantly over because they're filming everything in the Northeast. He's already that living legend. He was the living legend just a few years into his career, wasn't he?
He was, and if I could take you back a little bit, You talked about how the Zbyszko feud was kind of the end of Bruno's career. The Saturday after the Shea Stadium show, we had a new color commentator sitting next to Vince McMahon. It was Pat Patterson.
That's right.
So they took Bruno right off TV.
Bruno was the only one who didn't completely butcher the English language. It was Anthony DeRocca, then Bruno, then Patterson, and then back to Bruno. But Bruno Sammartino, some of the other feuds people obviously talk about. I remember when I was a kid, my dad wasn't a wrestling fan, but he knew Bruno Sammartino and Killer Kowalski didn't like each other. So that's like one of the ones that everyone talks about, Kowalski and Bruno. And of course, they had matches in the 60s, they had matches in the 70s. So many people think of them together. Monsoon, when they elevated him in 63 after Buddy left. That was a big deal. People still talk about Bruno and Monsoon. People talk about Bruno. You hear that he body slammed Haystack Calhoun. I think he just lifted him up, which was impressive enough. I'm not saying that wasn't impressive. And you obviously heard Bill Watts talk about what Bruno could do in the weight room. He was an impressive guy. But let's take a step back. I want to talk to wrestling historian Tom Burke, a friend of the show. Tom actually was a fan before Bruno. And what I mean is, Tom remembers wrestling and wrestling magazines before Bruno Sammartino was introduced. So I wanted to get his perspective on Bruno, on Bruno's career, on his role in wrestling history, and any personal anecdotes he had. So let's now go to this conversation with wrestling historian Tom Burke. We continue our look at Bruno Sammartino today by welcoming back to the program a longtime friend of the show, wrestling historian Tom Burke. Tom, thanks for being here today.
Brian, it's always a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I just want to say to all the 605ers out there, buy those T-shirts, kids.
Well, thank you very much. That was a free plug I didn't expect. I appreciate that. But, you have a unique perspective on things because not only are you a wrestling historian, but you're actually someone we could talk to who was a fan before Bruno. You didn't get to see Bruno for a long time. You were a fan before you even heard of Bruno. So let's go back to that period of time. When did you first start reading about Bruno? What did you first start hearing, and what did you think?
Well, I've been a fan since 1958, and Bruno made his debut in 59. However, I didn't hear or see Bruno or read about him until probably about 1960, when he was in one of the issues of like Wrestling Review magazine or one of the other magazines, and he appeared in Springfield on a show here, and I believe he wrestled with Tiger Jack Vansky. I did not go to the show because Mother didn't told me I wasn't going on a school night. Thank you, Mom. But that's beside the point. So I did not see Bruno actually wrestle till I got out of the Army in 1960. I got out of the Army in 69. I got a job in New York City in 1970, and that's the first time I saw Bruno Sammartino wrestle live. I did see him on TV, on the snowy black and white TV when they had wrestling from Washington, D.C. on Thursday nights, but it wasn't a clear picture, etc. But I did see him at various shows, the Sunnyside Garden, the Garden, etc., down in the New York City area.
He debuts in 59, and taking his blackballing by Vince McMahon Sr. out of the picture, right. He pretty quickly takes over from Rocca as the box office draw in New York and throughout the Northeast. So while this is happening and you're not seeing him and you're just reading the magazines, what are your impressions as the coverage is starting to come in? The coverage is mostly coming from New York City, and you're starting to see this relative newcomer get built up in this way.
Well, being a wrestling fan at the time, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, when the time came in 63, as the build-up took place and he defeated Rogers for the title, I was always aligned to the NWA, whoever the NWA champion was. And, of course, the Capitol Wrestling Office gave this scenario that the match wasn't had to be 2 out of 3 falls, blah, 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 and all this. Or they used some scenario like that. Well, Rogers, of course, wrestled Bruno at the Garden. It was only 1 fall, 48 seconds or something like that, and he got the title and everything. So it's like a little hypocritical. I was, a Mizark at the time, but I just wish those days were back sometimes. But in 63, I knew Bruno by the magazines, as you said. I never saw him wrestle till, as again I said, 7 years later in 1970. But you picked up a magazine, he was always there because they always focused on the New York market. The magazines did. So, I knew him there. And then, of course, he was the second Rocca. Rocca was such a big hit with the ethnic Italians and Latinos in New York City, because it was always based, a lot of New York City was promotion, East Coast promotion was based on ethnic stars. And Bruno just slid right in after he came back after his departure from Vince earlier. But he definitely was a draw, and of course, I don't know if you will recall this, Brian, but a lot of times the ethnic stars, Morales included, Spiros Arion, and Bruno would speak in their native tongue, be it Italian, Greek, or Spanish. And of course, this was highlighted in their promos and everything, which, attracted the fans into the venues.
Yeah, and Bruno had such a unique promo style to begin with because, he would get fired up when it was building up to the end of a feud with someone, but he would come out there and explain to people why he was feeling the way he did, what he was going to do to his opponent. And like you said, he would speak in some Italian, so that if you're sitting at home and you hear that, it really connects with you.
Oh, absolutely. And, it was a very personal touch. And of course, he self-promoted himself. There weren't any script writers then. Which is another issue I have with the product today. But, they all did this, and they were able to entice the fans to really attract the fans. And I gotta go see this match between Bruno and Buddy Rogers, or Bruno and Dr. Bill Miller, or Bill Watts, or whoever he might be wrestling, That was the big deal there, and it was something which definitely attracted the fans. I mean, even the turns that he had with his various opponents, Morales and Zbyszko, So I mean, all this stuff played out very, very well for everyone involved.
The sign of a professional wrestler becoming successful and being a draw in the early 60s was if Jack Pfeffer created a sound-alike wrestler that he could fool people into thinking could possibly be the original. You didn't get to see Bruno Sammartino live until 1970, but considering you grew up in Massachusetts, Tony Santos' territory, Jack Pfeffer's there, we've talked about it on the show. Talk a little bit about Bruno Sammartino.
Bruno Sammartino was an interesting character. I mean, he eventually wrestled for Vince McMahon and the title of Pancho Valdez. But he was a stable character in Santos land here, and he also appeared for Jack Pfeffer in Chicago as well. But when he was a main eventer at times for Santos, but he was a ham and egger. He was a good hand, but he also was a comedian and everything. He had a funny look. Sometimes he didn't have his dentures in the front, and he had a tattoo of an eagle on his chest and long hair. He was a heel. The last time I saw him was the month before I went in the Army, so it had to be February 66. He was in a tag team match. I can't remember who he wrestled in the tag, but I remember his tag team partner was Maurice Chevalier, who became Chris Cole. Matter of fact, I have a picture of them together walking out of the ring. And but he was a good hand, nothing spectacular. He definitely was not on the same par as his the original Bruno, but he had a charisma that the fans enjoyed.
He was completely the opposite of Bruno in terms of appearance and work in the ring.
Oh, absolutely.
But what was it like when he does go to work for Vince McMahon Sr., he does go to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and Bruno's there, and Bruno's already the living legend. What is it like when Bruno meets or runs into his Jack Pfeffer impersonator?
Well, I don't know exact. All I know is this. Abe Ford was a Tri-WF representative here in New England at late 60s and early 70s. Abe Ford had taken out a little ad in the Boston Herald stating that Bruno Sammartino the real Bruno Sammartino will only appear at Boston Garden, blah, 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 etc. And I asked Bruno about that ad when I had my radio show in 91. and Bruno was totally unaware of that ad. And I asked, I said, was there ever anything said in the office about Bruno Sam, your namesake, the other Bruno in New England? And he said, never. Now, I don't know if he was working me or what, but that's what he said. So I just found that interesting. Now, I never asked him about his personal contact with Valdez, because they definitely worked on shows together. But I just wonder how that. I really wonder how that went.
You know, Tom, someone whose name has come up in multiple segments on this show, and I think any episode about Bruno you have to, is Georgianne Orsi, Georgianne Macropolis. She had so many last names. Who can keep count? But you're reading about Bruno in the magazines. Of course, she was the president of the Buddy Rogers fan club and then the Bruno Sammartino fan club. But her relationship with Bruno really went beyond just fan club president and wrestler. She was really, in many ways, his confidant. And she really was someone who kept him informed about what was happening in the wrestling world. Talk a little bit about that, because I know when you moved to New York later on, you probably got to see a little bit of that firsthand. But talk a little bit about Georgianne and her relationship with Bruno.
Well, when I first met Georgianne, it would have been in, it would have been in 1970. I started Trailways in April of 1970. So probably like May or June, I met her. I wrote her a letter and blah, blah, blah. And there was a Guardian show coming up. I was not involved in the magazines at this point. And I went to the show. She was able to get me good tickets, because she had ways through the office to get tickets. So I got tickets. We all used to meet at the lounge up by the bowling alley and have some chow and then go to the show at the Garden. And but she was extremely influential. We talked almost all the time, and she gave me her phone number. We'd call, and she gave me bits and pieces of information, but it was selected information. But I know that she had a very good and intense relationship with Bruno and others as well in the WWF. She always had that ringside seat there. I think that she was the eyes and ears for Bruno in many ways. Yeah. Not only within the world of fandom, but also within wrestling itself, and meeting other people and getting vibes. And I'm sure the information got back to Bruno from her.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that people will know. John Arezzi here on this episode talked about being in that lounge by the bowling alley before Bruno won the world title, but Georgianne had been tipped off, so the celebration began before the show started. So there's a good example of her getting the information before anyone else would have had it in the mid-'70s. Exactly.
She definitely was, as you said, a confidant for Bruno, and she definitely had that role in his life. And I think that it also shows Bruno's acceptance of certain people in his life too that aren't fellow wrestlers as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Bruno always did seem to have a very special relationship, not just with his fans, but there certainly were a select group of fans, led by Georgianne.
Well, yeah, I have two stories to share. I have one story to share with you on that, which I'll mention now. As you know, Bruno was a victim of World War II. He was under the Nazis with his mother and the remaining family members. He came to the United States, as we all know the story, and blah, blah, blah. But an interesting fact is that there's a gentleman, I don't know if you know who he is. I'll mention his name, Walt Wolonsky, who is from Walter. Okay.
Early tape trader, yeah.
Yeah. Walt is from the Philadelphia area, New Jersey. He happens to be a Ukrainian. His father escaped the Nazis as well, in the same way that Bruno did after the war, as a DP, displaced person. Walter was very keen in wrestling, still is. Met Bruno, introduced Bruno to his father, and they chatted, and Bruno learned his history. And so they had this common bond. Bruno would call up Walter and ask him how his father was doing. And when Walter's father became ill, Bruno would call the father, tell him I'm thinking about him and talk to him and blah, blah, blah. So, it was a special bond, a bond that you and I will never, and I hope to God, never have to go through.
Yeah.
That is escaping that Nazi thing or a war of that level. So, it's just amazing. I stop and think about it. So that's, as you said a minute ago, about his relationship with fans. It wasn't overly public in the sense it was more private, and I think that's how he liked it to be.
Well, for the first time in Wrestling Podcast, we're about to make a transition from Wolansky to Kowalski, because I want to ask you, Tom, of course, everyone knows you had a great friendship with Killer Kowalski, Walter, as you know him, because you were his friend. Killer Kowalski may be the most famous, or at least he's in the top 5 of Bruno's opponents, because even casual fans or people who weren't big wrestling fans, those were 2 names that they knew, and those were 2 names in the Northeast that they knew didn't like each other, Bruno Sammartino and Killer Kowalski. But I'm sure all the time you spent around Killer Kowalski, he must have talked about Bruno.
They did not like each other publicly. But on a personal note, they were very good friends. As a matter of fact, remember Bruno when he had the fro?
Yes, he had the Luau Sindor, yes.
Yes. He went to a hair specialist, blah, blah, blah. He told Walter Kowalski about this. Kowalski went out and met the guy, and they fitted him with a toupee, And we're at a show in Worcester, and Bo Curry comes in. He hasn't seen Walter in 25 years. Curry looks up at Walter, and he says, "Hey, Kowalski, your hair looks like shit." I thought we were myself, Mike Madison, and a couple of the other boys were there. I thought we were going to die. I thought, and the Kowalski goes, "What's he going to do?" It's so funny. But but the association between Kowalski and Bruno was on a personal level thing, and they were friends.
What about Fez? Because I know you had a relationship with Fez, and obviously Fez was NWA, Bruno was WWF, and they never really did anything, after Bruno became the world champion in New York, but there were attempts to do stuff, at least between Sam Mushnick and Vince McMahon Sr. and Toots Mondt. What about Fez? Did he ever talk about Bruno with you?
Yes, he did. Now, of course, this, what Lou, as I recall, what Lou said, that Bruno was was strong in the ring, and he was a good wrestler. That Lou wrestled Bruno twice in Toronto, and before Bruno beat Rogers for the title. One went with a draw, and then the other one that Fez went over. But I think he respected him, But as years progressed, I think Bruno became more of a rough guy in the ring. His wrestling techniques had slowed down and everything. Whereas Fez, when he got older, I think he just continued wrestling as he was. I don't think, it seems to me that my recollection is that Fez respected him, but I think even in Fez's book, he had mentioned something to the effect that Bruno was more of a roughhouser, or something. Maybe that's not the right word, but maybe a brawler or something. But his later life. But I'd have to look at that book again and get the quote.
They probably were able to get along with each other due to their mutual dislike of Buddy Rogers. They probably could bond over that.
Man, that's a possibility. That's a great possibility.
Tom, Bruno makes his debut in the Garden at the beginning of 1960. His opponent, Wild Bull Curry.
Wild Bull Curry, and Bull did the job.
One of the things we think about with Bruno was, and I don't mean this in any sort of disrespectful way, if anyone wants to take it that way, that's not what I'm saying, but Bruno held tight to kayfabe until the very end.
Oh, absolutely.
And Bruno, we talk about how he was so terrific with his fans, and there were certain people he let in, but he was very respectful in keeping kayfabe to the very
Yes.
end. Even the shoot interviews he did, he never explicitly says anything, but he implies things. And if you know what he's talking about, you can figure it out. But what about like way back, like in the fan club days when you had WFIA? Did you ever deal with Bruno?
Yes, we did. I was involved in the WFIA in hierarchy. In 1969, we ran a convention in Pittsburgh, which was, of course, Bruno's town. Bruno was he was not the public promoter. Ace Freeman was, but he was the actual guy behind the scenes. When the convention was proposed and Freeman accepted, not thinking, I guess, of anything, Bruno gave the word that none of the boys was to show up. He didn't want baby faces or heels together or any acknowledgement, even separately, to be there. He was totally kayfabe. He said to Don Wilson, who was the president, he was the founder of the WFIA, executive director. He says, "I don't want this to be like an Academy Awards show." You know, that was his mental state. Two of the guys showed up at the convention: Killer Kowalski and Tony Marino. Tony Marino came Sunday, the last day of the convention. Kowalski got on the podium and had said publicly that no one tells me where I can go and who I can speak to, and which was, what's Bruno going to do with Kowalski? Is his arch rival? He can't fire him, but it took gazoos for Walter to do that, and I respected him from that day on, and Tony Marino as well. Tony Marino came that Sunday, the last day, and just walked around, talked to people, and blah blah blah. Very cordial, but he was not political about it. But the actions is political, and that was the only time that I can recall Bruno ever having anything to do with a WFIA convention. Years later, when John Arezzi would run a convention, and the mental state of wrestlers changed, Bruno accepted and attended a convention for John Arezzi. And of course, I think he did other signings and what do they call them? WrestleCons, etc. over the years, more recently.
I brought up how, because the magazines were all located or mostly located in New York, Bruno ended up on the covers of so many of them. But beyond that, from your experience working for the wrestling magazines, how much of a boost in sales did you get by having Bruno on the cover?
Oh, absolutely. I think, I'll give you a prime example. Ring Magazine. Nat Louvet, who's the editor and publisher of Ring Wrestling, he was very good friends with Arnie Skolin. And Arnie would take the magazines, the Ring Wrestling magazines, and sell them at the venues, and when it was WWF or Tri-WF. And, that was a big plus. And, of course, when you have Bruno on the cover and your WWF stars, naturally the sales would rise. And as for that would be in-house at the arenas. And then, of course, you have the after magazines and the other magazines on the newsstands with Bruno on the cover as well. And, that was a plus, and it would, I'm sure that their sales numbers would increase when they'd have Bruno on the cover rather than, say, Tex McKenzie.
Yeah, of all the people for you to compare Bruno Sammartino to, Tex McKenzie.
No, because there was an issue of Wrestling World where there's a cover of Tex McKenzie. It just dawned on my head.
And I believe there's a landfill somewhere filled.
Yeah, there's a landfill someplace too.
That issue. Well, let me ask you this, Tom. Looking back at wrestling history, and you became a fan at the end of the 50s, but I know you're knowledgeable about wrestling history because, as you've talked about previously on the show, you almost instantly were interested in the history of the business. So you know about Landis, you know about all the big drawing cards in history. Where does Bruno rank to you amongst the biggest wrestling stars in history?
Honestly, you have to realize, of course, this also goes back to like Landis you had just mentioned. And again, this goes back to an ethnic thing where Landis really capitalized on his ethnic background and the promoters pushed it. But I would say Bruno would probably be if you were to take the top 5 guys, I'd say Bruno would probably be actually number 1, to be honest with you, in modern terms. For the length of time he was on top, where he wrestled, all over the East Coast, of course. But then he also worked in San Francisco, which had a big Italian population. Toronto had a big Italian population. Also he went to Australia for a tour there, and he went to Japan. He hit all those markets, and of course, knowing the Italian base in these cities and territories, they use that as a vehicle. Of course, he would just open his mouth and chat all these words in Italian, and boom.
Of course, we've talked a lot about Bruno in Madison Square Garden. We've talked about Bruno in Boston. Bruno wasn't just a Northeast wrestler. Recently on the Jim Cornette Experience, we talked about Bruno in Indianapolis. Dave Drayson was on. We talked about Bruno in Detroit. We've had a few chances on the Super Podcast to talk about Bruno in different areas. Let's go to this recording from a few episodes back with Wayne St. Wayne, his memories of being in the crowd in St. Louis in 1973 when Bruno Sammartino came into St. Louis. When Bruno Sammartino, who they'd been reading about in the magazines, came in. A lot of things have been said about these shows over many years, including people saying that Bruno didn't get over to the St. Louis fans. Well, let's hear what Wayne St. Wayne has to say. In 73, Bruno Sammartino made several appearances, and of course he had been the biggest star in the Northeast and for the WWF. A lot of people have said that was kind of like a culture shock, seeing him in St. Louis, and that he didn't really get over to the point where a lot of people thought he would have. What do you remember about Bruno in St. Louis?
Well, I remember the first show that he was here was the main event against Ivan Koloff. And I believe it was in April of 73. And I remember it was a lot of people in the audience not really buying it because they did that style where they never really clamped into any real hold necessarily. It was sort of like reversals and throws and off the rope and sunset flip, monkey flip or whatever, constant motion kind of thing. And people weren't really buying it because they were more used to the grueling kind of realistic match, O'Connor and Valentine kind of stuff, or Gene Kiniski, where they would work a body part and work a hold, and gradually build up the heat. So, but I remember in a couple months' time, in June, I think it was June 15th maybe, the first time Harley Race won the title. And during that first reign as the world champion, he only had the one title defense, and it was against Bruno in St. Louis. I mean, he had the title defense. He was only appeared here once as world champion during his first time as world champion. That was against Bruno Sammartino. And I believe it was June 15th, I think, of 73. I remember that was
pretty miraculous. You remember the date exactly.
Well, I remember a couple of years ago looking up a bunch of results just for fun and reminiscing, and especially the years before I started going, and wishing I could, a lot of people, if they asked if they had a chance to go back in time, where would they go and what would they see? And they might have in mind historical events like, I don't know, the civil rights crowd in Washington, D.C. in 1963 or something, or the moon, watching the moon landing, but mine would be, if I could go back in time, I would go to Friday Night Wrestling at Kiel Auditorium and see some of those matches I missed all those years that, before I started following wrestling. But I forgot what I was talking about. That always happens.
We were talking about Bruno, and, you bring up how it was a big style difference. I mean, case in point, on that April show you mentioned, he's in the main event against Koloff, and look at what's underneath it. It's Billy Robinson and Jack Briscoe versus the Miller Brothers.
Yeah. Well, one thing I do remember, though, by the time they had the title match with Harley against Bruno, maybe Harley was helping him, or maybe, Bruno was probably, I'm sure, talented enough to pick up that, the more solid old wrestling style, because I remember they had an hour-long Broadway, and, man, that was one of the greatest matches ever, and they took their time, work to hold. It just kind of gradually built the heat up. And I don't really remember all the spots. I just sort of remember being really impressed. And I think that would be on that list of best matches. That's, some of the best matches I've ever seen. That would be Harley Race and Bruno Sammartino.
Wow.
So Bruno did adapt to that style, though, pretty well. But yeah, at first, I guess he didn't really get over all that big, from what I remember.
Italian wrestlers were always big draws in Jim Barnett's Australian wrestling promotion, World Championship Wrestling. Of course, Dominic DeNucci was a major star there. Mario Milano, a major star there. And Bruno Sammartino was a major attraction in Australia. Here's wrestling historian Ed Locke talking a little bit about Bruno in Australia. You talk about this idea that they were told you need a strong Italian babyface. And of course, it was, I believe, early 66 when the opposition, when George Gardner actually announced that he had dates on Bruno Sammartino. At that time, the biggest star at Madison Square Garden, the biggest star in the Northeast, of course, the Italian Superman, as everyone knows, but it never happened. And later that year, of course, he would show up, but for the Barnett office.
For 2 tours. Yeah, definitely. Being fans, obviously, we weren't really privy to any of the wheelings and dealings, but I would assume that the Barnett probably outbid Gardner, especially having lost Orion for him. Orion only wrestled a few matches for Gardner that I can find any details of, but yeah, I think Barnett was probably pretty determined that he wouldn't be outbid on Bruno, on Sammartino, and he offered him what was record money for Australia in those days. And as we say, Bruno did 2 tours for Barnett and was a great success also.
One of the central themes about Bruno's career is he really didn't spend too much time away from his home territory when he was active. And this goes for Japan. Bruno wasn't like the typical wrestler who went over to Japan. He never worked a full tour, but he still had very important matches that still to this day resonate with people. His matches with Giant Baba. He was there for the first All Japan tour. He was someone they brought back whenever they brought back legends. And actually, I just saw a photo from this past weekend. After the death of Mrs. Baba, the wife of Giant Baba, they had an in-ring ceremony honoring the death of Mrs. Baba as well as Bruno Sammartino, holding up pictures of both of them. So here in 2018, All Japan Pro Wrestling, different ownership, a completely different company than what it used to be. Still honoring the memory of Bruno Sammartino. I'm very happy to say I had an opportunity to speak to wrestling historian Fumi Saito about Bruno Sammartino in Japan, as well as Bruno's relationship with Giant Baba. Let's go to this right now. I am very happy to welcome to the Super Podcast someone who's been mentioned on the air several times in the past. He's a journalist, he's a writer, he's a historian, and that, of course, is Fumi Saito. Fumi, welcome to the program.
How are you? Hi, from Tokyo.
Well, thank you. You know, it took us a little while to arrange a time that worked for both of us, but here you are, you're in Tokyo, and we're talking Bruno Sammartino today. And I know that Bruno had a very special relationship with Baba, but let's talk about Bruno's relationship with Japan. When did Bruno first start going over? And also, when did the Japanese fans first start hearing about Bruno Sammartino?
Oh, in early 60s, and also those days, news traveled a lot slower. And also, the actual distance hasn't changed, obviously, but the New York was pretty far away in the 60s, you know? A lot of wrestlers, including Giant Baba, Anthony Inoki, Jumbo, you know, Fujinami, Ricky Josh, all those people traveled to States and had their own tours. But a lot of times, you know, even back in Ricky Dawson's days, Japanese wrestlers go to Hawaii, California, you know, San Francisco, LA, all those places. But New York was pretty far away then. And Bruno Sammartino was the champion of Madison Square Garden, something you read about, not actually expect to do that much of a, you know, back and forth tour like Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody days.
Right.
And, Bruno Sammartino was always somebody you read about, that real legend and the real world heavyweight champion from America.
Yeah, you know, you said something interesting there. When you think about really the first generation of Japanese pro wrestling. You think of Ricky Dozan battling the Sharp brothers. You think of Ricky Dozan and the Destroyer, Ricky Dozan and Fred Blassie. It really is based on the West Coast. And meanwhile,
pretty much California. That's it. In Hawaii.
And Hawaii. Yeah. But, if you think about the end of the 70s, you think about the 80s, and all of a sudden Madison Square Garden is such a big name in Japanese wrestling. It means so much.
Yeah.
When did that start? When did Madison Square Garden really...
During late 60s and 70s, we had TV show called Pro Wrestling Hour, American film from, New York. It was aired as a wrestling program in Japan, Channel 12. All those, real old black and white film from Antonino Rocca days. And we were watching it as a kid. Yeah. No Japanese wrestlers. They put Japanese commentary on black and white film from Buffalo, New York. And so that was a first experience for us. And also, basically, Japanese wrestling fans have always been pretty much reading oriented. Like Tokyo Sports, Pro Wrestling Magazine, Baseball Magazine, the Gong Magazine, and all those things. We've been reading wrestling as much as we're reading and watching it. And Bruno Sammartino was somebody we read about always. Champion of Madison Square Garden. And we didn't have much of videos during the 70s. Probably not until early 80s. Not until everybody has VCR at your house. And until then, during the 70s, New York seemed pretty far away. Something you always read about. Or, kind of seemed far away. But Bruno Sammartino was the champion from that era. And also, we had comic books, Giant Typhoon. It's a comic book about Giant Baba's wrestling days in America. And Bruno Sammartino was one of the main characters in that comic book.
Of course, Baba main evented against Bruno in, I want to say...
1964.
I was about to say early 64, right before Bill Watts arrived there. And then,
right.
So, they had that relationship. They had that history. And is that why Bruno was featured in the Baba comic?
Yeah, and then also the whole comic book was about Giant Baba's trip to America and how he spent his whole year there. Killer Kowalski was in there. People like Hardboiled Haggerty, Vince McMahon Sr., and all the landscape, all those, New York City things. And it was something we read about as a kid. And Bruno Sammartino was one of the main characters and had a friendship with Baba. Some of the story, yes, it's a comic book, so it's some of them are fiction, some of them are fantasy, but it's always based on the reality. And we read Bruno Sammartino in our comic book before we actually seen him.
In terms of the magazines, you say how Japanese wrestling fans have always been reading centric, and that's always been apparent. And if you look at those old issues of Gong from the 70s, they're amazing, not just for the photography, but just without even knowing Japanese, the amount of information packed into those.
Look at them.
What was the 60s like? Before Gong really took off in the 70s, what was the 1960s like in terms of media coverage for Japanese wrestling?
It was very limited, not small territory, but what took place in Madison Square Garden, what took place in, let's say, Olympic Auditorium from LA, and that's about it. AWA in Minnesota, Vern Gagne, didn't even start coming until 1970s. So, just big cities. The things are quite different because people like Buddy Rogers or even people like Gorgeous George, they did not have Japan tour.
Right. Yeah, it was really Thez.
Lou Thez was the first real world heavyweight champion who came to Japan, 1957. Yeah. And actually, they didn't even mention the name NWA then. The Lou Thez came in as the world heavyweight champion. We didn't learn about it,
In terms of the magazines, you mentioned that they covered LA and WWF or WWF, and that was really it. But what was there? In the 1970s, I know Gong magazine, and the 80s, eventually everything goes weekly, and that changes the whole landscape of Japanese magazines. But what was the Japanese magazine scene like in the 60s for wrestling?
Oh, we come out once a month. So I was reading it religiously every month. Yeah. Back to back, page to page. I read every page of it. Serious wrestling fan would do. And then also we always had once or twice weekly, wrestling show on television, network television. And traditionally, Japanese wrestling company bring in top-notch American wrestlers each tour. Every tour. Like we always had 8 to 9 tours, 8 to 9, 3 to 5 week tour. Headliner, it would be Freddie Blassie, the Dick Beyer, the Gene Koniski, you name all those 60s superstars. They come in and tour 3 to 5 weeks, and they'll be on television those months. And so we, just by being in Japan, we were able to witness all the top stuff from all kinds of different territories. Pat O'Connor, everybody.
When did the American magazines first show up there? Like, when did you first see an American wrestling magazine?
Ooh, it was never that big. For one thing, it's written in English, and that was part of the reason I really wanted to learn the language and wanted to, be able to read and understand. And the Wrestling Review was the first American wrestling magazine I read as a kid. Wrestling Review. And I believe that the front page was Bruno then.
Every wrestling magazine that came out of New York, Bruno Sammartino was on the cover.
Pretty much. Right, yeah. Right. That too, yeah.
Well, talk about when Bruno...
In Japan.
When Bruno first starts coming over to Japan, yeah.
1967 as WWF World Heavyweight Champion. What was interesting was, though, Bruno did not defend WWF title in Japan. He came in wearing the belt, championship belt and everything, but he challenged Giant Baba's international heavyweight title as a challenger. Same thing happened the same year, 1967. Gene Koniski came in with NWA belt. He did not defend that belt. He challenged Giant Baba international heavyweight title instead. And back then, champion meant, or title match meant, always 60-minute, 2 out of 3 fall match. And in this case, Baba against Bruno twice, 1967 and 1968. Baba against Gene Koniski, 1967 and 1968, twice each. Always had 60-minute Broadway, 2 out of 3 fall match, 1 and go time limit. It seemed like a formula then.
How was Bruno built up before the Baba match, and was it a big deal on that tour?
A real big deal, yeah, because they held the title match at the baseball stadium in Osaka, yeah. So not like a sumo palace or the, arena that holds 10 to 15,000 people. They used baseball stadium instead, expecting 30 to 40,000 people. Real world champion from New York coming in. And also backstory was these two are friends.
How many people did show up in the baseball stadium?
Oh, the 35,000. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And also the backstory is very important in Japan. And also it's not like babyface heel situation. It's two babyface respected each other and had a dream title match.
They tried to do that in New York with Bruno against Pedro in 72, but...
Right, the Shea Stadium.
Yeah, very different, though. Right. But there was that backstory. People knew that Baba and Bruno did have some sort of relationship, and that relationship continued. You mentioned he was there in 67. You mentioned he was there in 68.
And after that, it was a 73 was next tour, right when Giant Baba opened All Japan Pro Wrestling. Yeah, 1967 match, yeah. 67 match and 68 match was held under old JWA, that the Rikidozan's Nippon Pro Wrestling Company. And Baba was still working for that, old company. Then he went independent from the old company. Then that old company went under shortly after. But the Baba officially opened All Japan Pro Wrestling in 1973, and Bruno Sammartino was the headliner for the opening series.
And how much credibility did that give All Japan right off the bat?
Right off the bat, that is the company. And that Channel 4, NTV, Nippon TV, switched from GWA to All Japan Pro Wrestling at the time. And so it looked to me, though, I was like a kid, but Giant Baba's All Japan became that company then. And Bruno was the first, headliner for the first tour they had. In fact, Bruno Sammartino, Freddie Bassi, Terry Funk, Dominic DeNucci, quite a few others, but Bruno was the main guy there.
And boy, if you're going to really try to establish your promotion as the premier promotion in a country, having Fred Blassie there, who was a legendary opponent of Ricky Dozan, having Bruno on the tour, having a Funk on the tour, I mean, that's how
and
you do it.
And also Dory Funk Sr. together. Dory Funk Sr. and Terry Funk. And Dory Jr. would come in the following tour. Yeah. And the Dick Beyer coming in, Oh, yeah. Saturday night, 8 o'clock, Channel 4. Great primetime program. Network channel, though. Yeah.
I mean, Dick Beyer became a national celebrity based off that.
Yeah, and also, tonight we have to talk about Bruno, but if you give me 30 seconds. Dick Beyer, Destroyer, was a huge star. And he was the first one also had a run as Japanese side, There was a single match, Destroyer against Giant Baba. And Destroyer said, if I lose this title match, I will join All Japan as Japanese group. So he ended up living here some 7 years after that. He moved his whole family over, and all his kids went to school in Japan. And it was like a very, very good drama, And I believed it.
Like you said, it's all about backstory. That's really
all right, that. Yeah, but Bruno was the main guy on Baba's Old Japan's very first tour.
Why did Bruno hate Inoki so much? And maybe hate's a strong word, but Bruno certainly didn't like Inoki, and he wanted to go with Baba.
Not liking or disliking, but see, when Bruno came and did tours with old JWA company, there were tag team situations where one team had Inoki and the other side had Bruno. So Bruno and Inoki actually worked in the ring, though. They had. And there's not much video footage now, but yes, there were more than one occasion Inoki and Bruno were in the same ring at the same time. And clearly, when Baba was number one guy for JWA company, Inoki was still number two, clearly, until he opened New Japan Pro Wrestling.
Right. And of course, he opens New Japan, and a few years later, he has
73.
This
73, actually, same year. Same
year, yeah. JWA implodes, and All Japan and New Japan both open up. And then a few years later, Inoki reaches that deal with Vince McMahon Sr. for him to book American Talent.
Right. 74, yeah.
He gets the cream of the crop out of New York, except he does not get Bruno.
Right. Yeah, there's always two sides in this story. I'm not sure if Inoki really wanted to use Bruno either, though, because it's so established that he's like a Giant Baba's friend and rival, and he already appeared in All Japan Ring. And if Bruno did work for New Japan with Inoki would want to beat him, right? Don't you think?
Yeah, Inoki wanted to beat everybody. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, that too. But that could happen, no? But the interesting thing is, though, Vince McMahon Sr. and New Japan, Inoki's New Japan Pro Wrestling, actually cut a deal, business affiliates, right? All the New York superstars started coming in. But Bruno apparently said, no, I ain't going. And it worked. If any guy under contract, you would follow the rule, right? So Bruno actually could pull this thing and he could flex his muscle. No, I'm not going to opposition. I'm with Giant Baba. And apparently Vince said okay about it, right? Vince Sr.
I don't think he had a choice. I don't think he had any choice.
Right.
Bruno.
But interesting thing was, though, 1976, June 26th to be exact, Antonio Inoki against Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, of course. And they did the Shea Stadium simulcast with Bruno.
Right. The main main promoter was WWF in America. It was more like Vince McMahon Jr., our Vince McMahon now. He was in charge. But Vince McMahon family was not so confident that this event could make money or draw people. And Vince McMahon Sr. went ahead and said, Bruno, please work this night at the main event. So apparently people did come over to Shea Stadium to watch Stan against Bruno instead of Muhammad Ali against Inoki. So it was technically they worked the same show.
Yeah, and Bruno was in the hospital. Bruno was in the hospital with a broken neck from Stan Hansen.
Right, only 2 months later. Yeah, it's been only 2 months after that. Yeah. Before that. So it was interesting that, so technically, Inoki, Muhammad Ali, Bruno Sammartino, Stan Hansen, Andre the Giant, and Chuck Wepner all worked the same show. Technically.
Technically, yes.
Yeah.
Technically,
yeah, right.
I think Jack Briscoe wrestled Dory Funk Jr. on that same show in Atlanta that night.
In Atlanta, right. Yeah. Or Miami, Terry Funk against Rocky Johnson, or Vern Gagne, Bockwinkel from Chicago, all over the place.
Yeah.
But, But 40 years later, just had that the people watch after MMA knowledge. If you watch Muhammad Ali Inoki fight now on the same footage, I think the match looks different now. Actually, the match is really exciting. Trust my word.
People can appreciate someone laying on their back much more now than they did then because they've seen jiu-jitsu. They've seen that, that's actually a way to fight. Yeah.
This is what you should do. Yeah. And so afraid to touch each other too, but yeah.
But going back to Bruno, what about Bruno's other All Japan tours? I mean, did he do anything memorable?
Okay, after that, he had quite a few tours. And altogether, he had 10, 12 tours. But after this All Japan thing, there was like a 76, Baba's PWF, Pacific Wrestling Federation title against Bruno's WWF title, double title match in Japan. That happened. Baba against Bruno again, more matured. 75, 76, double title match. Bruno's WWF title against Baba's Pacific Wrestling Federation PWF title, double title match. Of course, double count-out. Both kept the title in each title, but that happened. And also 1982, 10th anniversary show for All Japan. Baba and Bruno Sammartino made a tag team together for the first time. And the last time, I guess. Baba, Bruno against Taigajit Singh and Umanosuke Ueda. So Baba and Bruno's tag team happened.
And that, of course, was 81, because that's when Bruno wrapped it up for his first retirement.
Right, so then 81, October of 81 then, right? Yeah. 10th anniversary show for Giant Baba's All Japan Company. And that was the last tour he worked as an active wrestler, but he did come back for a few more tours for retro, the All Japan during the 90s. Giant Baba invited a lot of legends over, people like Bruno Sammartino, Killer Kowalski, Don Leo Jonathan, King Curtis,
Fritz von Erich,
Bayer, of course.
Yeah.
Fritz von Erich, yeah. So then they had an interview talk segment in the ring. And also, they had the meet and greet with your legend. It was just a great thing to have. So Bruno was the first guest on that thing, too. And after that, very last tour Bruno had was after Baba died. The year after Baba died, Baba died in January of 1999. 1 year later, they had Baba's retirement card. They did not say it's a memorial card. They wanted to announce it as Baba is retiring in this show. And they placed Baba's big ring boots in the middle of the ring. The people who came was Bruno Sammartino, Gene Koniski, and Dick Bayer from America. The friendship with those real legends are very important in Baba's legacy. Something Inoki didn't really share. Okay, you may have to understand this Japanese wrestling. All Japan, Baba's All Japan, lot of American, all the American superstars come in, right? Babyface work like babyface, heel work like heel, just like what you do in America. Right. Understand?
Yeah.
Whereas Inoki's New Japan Pro Wrestling, anybody or any superstars, like a big babyface like Dusty Rhodes or Pedro Morales or even Jack Briscoe, they all work like a heel when they come here. Or Andre the Giant, big heel.
Right. Against
big babyface Antonio Inoki. Inoki beat him. Even those people I read about in this wrestling magazine from America or other, sources, that Dusty Rhodes' American Dream, people like Pedro Morales or Jack Briscoe, just these people are big babyface in America. As a kid, I did not understand why these people would make running and stuff, beating up people and chasing audience and use illegal tactics or whatever, that they work like a heel. Because it's always going to be Antonio Inoki, big Japanese babyface against American as a heel. So little different method they used.
Yeah, meanwhile, you look at All Japan, and you have a guy like a Destroyer who gets over so big and becomes really part of the national fabric.
Babyface.
Terry Funk, I mean, has there ever been a bigger...
Yeah, the Funks. Oh,
have they ever been bigger
huge
American baby faces than the Funks?
Huge. Yeah, huge.
And same thing with Bruno.
Boy. Yeah. Bruno, yeah, because it doesn't have to be babyface, but somebody you respect. This is a big deal, real legend. And the living legend, well, now, people tend to abuse the term legend, but Bruno Sammartino's nickname, living legend, he was the first one to use that, nickname. And yes, this guy is the living legend. Yeah. And also, one more thing, did they use Powerhouse for Bruno's nickname?
I mean, it's been said about, I don't know about it as a nickname, but it's certainly one of the things.
Okay, term, yeah, like a
term you would hear, yeah.
Yeah, we translated that as a human power plant. The power plant? Yeah, human power plant. So it's stuck. Ningen Hatsudensho is like a nickname everybody knows in Japan. That's Bruno Sammartino. Human power plant. There you go.
Wow, I never heard that before.
Mystic portion. Just, I don't think he had enough tour that people understand his work or the maneuvers. See, when you watch Stan Hansen or Bruiser Brody or Funks or even Mil Maskers, Abdul the Butcher, all these guys work so many tours here. People know each and every move they make here. Not just spinning into a hold or anything, but everything they do in the ring, people know for sure. But Bruno only had important single match and never had 5-week tour or anything. Even though the tour was 5 week long, Bruno would come in last 5 days and have 3 matches. That's about it. So he was always treated differently. He only worked very important big shows. Maybe the schedule was tight, I guess, but he never worked the full tour or full schedule. He come in and do the important big show, and he'd be gone the following week. But that made him even bigger. Yeah.
I was going to say, how many other guys did that? Was that a common thing with NWA champions?
Yeah, that too. But yeah, the real short stay treatment thing. Fritz Von Erich, and the Sheik, and Detroit's original Sheik. He always came in short. Fritz Von Erich, the Sheik, Bruno Sammartino, and Gene Koniski. That's about it. Dory Funk Jr. always worked the whole tour.
Yeah.
Even Harley Race, while he was, NWA champion, he would still come in and do 3-week tour. Yeah, a little different. Bruno was always treated differently. And also Baba's generation. Obviously generation older than Harley Race and Funks or Abby.
One of the things I talked to Fumi Saito about there, John, was Bruno in the wrestling magazines. And of course, in America, if you went to the newsstand, more than likely Bruno Sammartino was on the cover of at least one, if not several, of the magazines on the newsstand. They came out of the Northeast, but it wasn't just that simple. Bruno actually did boost the sales when he was on the cover of the magazines. What do you remember about seeing magazines in the 70s, John?
I mean, I remember, first of all, one thing I remember is all the blood on the covers of the magazine, something we haven't seen for a long, long time. But secondly, Bruno by far was on the cover of the most magazines, especially the Apter magazines. I mean, one reason was because Apter's crew went to Madison Square Garden every month and they took pictures. But like you said, number two, most important, if Bruno was on the cover of that magazine, sales increased.
John Arezzi's been on the show before. Of course, John, amongst many other things he's done around wrestling, was a photographer for the magazines. So I wanted to talk to John a little bit about Bruno, about what it was like to shoot ringside. when Bruno's in Madison Square Garden main eventing and the fans are going nuts. I wanted to talk to him what it was like to be an Italian kid in New York, growing up a Bruno Sammartino fan. And of course, John later on in the 90s was involved in all the controversy that was around the World Wrestling Federation at that time. The famous Donahue show. Bruno Sammartino was there. John Arezzi was there with him. Bruno was a frequent guest on John's show, as well as appearing at John's various conventions. So let's now go to this conversation with friend of the show, John Arezzi. I am very happy to welcome back to the Super Podcast a longtime friend of the show, John Arezzi. And of course, John knew Bruno, but at the beginning, when you go really way back, John's important to have here because you can't tell the story of Bruno Sammartino without having an Italian kid from Brooklyn on the show to talk about Bruno Sammartino. So, John, welcome back to the program.
Always a pleasure to be here with you, Brian. And it's been a sad week with losing Bruno, but also a time for remembrance and certainly the publicity, the remembrance from everybody in the industry. It's been really heartwarming to see how everyone has paid tribute to this remarkable legend.
When did you first see Bruno? What are your first memories of him?
Well, I remember the very first time I saw Bruno Sammartino, and that was on Channel 5 in New York. It was wrestling. It was the very first time I saw wrestling. My older sister, 5 years older than me, called me into the living room because there was these guys, they were, the little people, I guess you call them, in a ring and chasing each other around the ring. So it was like, what the heck is this? I didn't know what it was. So it was back in the day. It was probably Skylar Low or Little Bruce or one of those guys. And so it was just kind of glued to the TV. And then there was this wrestler, Dr. Jerry Graham, who was in a match that night, and he was beating on Bruno's cousin, I guess they called him back then, Antonio Pugliese, Tony Parisi. And so we're watching this unfold in front of our eyes, and I'm probably 6 or 7 years old. I would guess that could be the time period, 6 or 7 years old. And then there's a big rumble in the crowd, and a gentleman throws a suitcase into the ring, and he's in a suit and tie, and it was Bruno coming in, doing a run-in, I guess, from the airport. He had just gotten into town, so he ran in, picked up the suitcase, and he whacked Dr. Jerry Graham on the head, and Graham juiced, and it was kind of like this blood pouring out of this guy, and then it breaks up, and he goes to the announcer's table, and that was Ray Morgan doing the play-by-play. And he was like, well, Dr. Jerry Graham, it looks like you need a doctor. He goes, I'm my own doctor. And that was kind of it. That was my first time ever seeing this Bruno Sammartino, and I was hooked on wrestling from that point forward. And then he was the champion, and he was on TV every week doing an interview or promoting whoever he was going to fight. So that was kind of the first time I saw Bruno Sammartino. And then after, getting to become a fan at such a young age, my Italian grandmother, who was born in Italy, I had no clue that she would know who Bruno Sammartino was, and I just started watching. And I was staying by her house one weekend, and she came into the house like all excited because she had went down to shop. My grandmother used to shop for her fruit and vegetables and down on Orchard Street in New York City. And she came in, I just saw Bruno Sammartino. I was like, what? And I was this little kid, and she was like, and I went up to him, and I was like, Bruno Sammartino. And he was like, Signore, please, shh. If you say who I am, people are going to mob me. And so she told me that story, and I remember it. And it was over 50-something years ago. So, I mean, that was my first experiences with Bruno, and I was a fan, forever. And there was even a time where I went to go to Madison Square Garden to see him wrestle Gorilla Monsoon, but I was under 14, and we'd gotten tickets and showed up and couldn't get in. So that was kind of heartbreaking. So that was another early Bruno story. And then basically just kind of followed his career and was shocked the day he lost the title to Ivan Koloff, because there was a big feature story in Newsday, the Long Island newspaper, that Bruno had actually lost. And at that time, I was just turning 14 that month. And then I started going to the Garden, but, Bruno was already gone, but he was still the living legend. Getting a little bit further on, as I became a little bit more integrated into wrestling, started the Freddie Blassie fan club, started then writing for some of the magazines, then met Georgianne Macropolis, Mike Omansky, and we used to hang out at the bowling alley upstairs from Madison Square Garden. And then he came back and won the title from Stasiak, and we all knew that day that he was going to win the title. It was a celebration before the show even took place. But Bruno was that guy. He was that special guy. He was that person that you seen as soon as he made his way through the curtain, the crowd would erupt. And it was something like it, to this day, I really still have not seen as far as the love and the adulation that everybody had for him, from the fans, to the boys.
It really is amazing when you go back and you look at all the crowds he drew in Madison Square Garden and all the sellouts he drew in Madison Square Garden during the years where children couldn't go to shows.
True. No kids under 14, and that was a big deal. I mean, it was all adults, and it was just kind of an amazing time back then. And, certainly, as you know my story, I had gotten back into the pro wrestling business full-time in 1989, starting the Pro Wrestling Spotlight on 1440 WNYG on Long Island, little station. And as I was planning the show, I, of course, wanted to reach out to everybody and see who we could partner with, and call the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, or the World Wrestling Federation at the time, and spoke to a kid named Steve Planamenta, who was head of PR at the time, and he immediately knew who I was because he was a fan of mine when I was a photographer. I met Steve Planamenta through a kid I went to college with, and he lived in the same town as Steve. And then when he said he knew John Arezzi, Steve went crazy when Steve was a little kid. And now here I am talking to him on the phone. I had no idea he was the head of public relations for WWF. So he was happy to hear from me, and I said I was starting this radio show, and I'd love to get cooperation and interview wrestlers and do promotions. And he was like, boy, all of that sounds great. He goes, but I just want to tell you one thing. I mean, there's another guy in New York, this guy Rich Mancuso, who does this hour on WFAN, and he really trashes the business, and he exposes the business. And as long as as long as you are kind to us, we're going to be able to work with you. And so for the very first Pro Wrestling Spotlight, April 9th, 1989, the WWF provided Jimmy Hart for me. During that week, I had been talking to wrestling contacts like George Napolitano and Bill Apter, and I was trying to accumulate phone numbers because I wanted to bring Bruno Sammartino on because he was my hero. So I got the number from George, I believe, of Bruno, and I called him up and asked him to do an interview with me on my radio show and explain how much I loved him. And I think I even told him the story about my grandmother back in the day. And he certainly agreed to do an interview with me, but he went right after the WWF, and that was right, when he had that split up, and there was a lot of heat, and how he hated the way the business had become. And after I did that interview, I had taped it for air. It wasn't live. I was like, boy, I have to, I don't know what to do with this. Should I play it? Should I not play it? I was like, it's compelling. And then I reached out to Steve Planamenta, and I was like, listen, I just did an interview with Bruno Sammartino, because I really had no clue how much heat there was between them. And Steve was like, can I hear that interview? I was like, well, yeah, my show airs in about a week. I'll get it played for you on the phone here. And basically I did. And he was like, you're not going to air that, are you? I was like, well, I think I have to. He goes, well, if you air an interview like that, we're not going to be able to do anything with you. I was like, I just made a gut decision and said, well, I have to air the interview, and I did. And that was the end of my cooperation with the World Wrestling Federation for a good length of time. I only had one other interview, and that was with Freddie Blassie, but that was the only time the WWF cooperated with me. But Bruno, I mean, he was very passionate, very to the point. He never, ever blew smoke. He always was speaking his mind. He always was saying what he felt in his heart and what he felt about the business. and I grew to respect him even more back then. And it was just it was great to get to know him. Afterwards, I immediately, when I started doing my wrestling fan conventions, he was at every single one of them. And he was the only wrestler that wouldn't allow me to charge for an autograph. He actually sat separate from all the boys, so he could sit and mingle with the fans and sign anything for anyone with no cost.
I think he was the last athlete, period, to do that, because if you ever go to a baseball card show or anything else, you see that everyone's charging for an autograph. Everyone. He was the one guy. I mean, I know he held out until maybe the 2000s. He was the one guy who never charged.
Right. Yeah, I know probably towards the latter part of his life that he maybe allowed promoters to charge for an autograph, but he was steadfast in that, and he just wanted to have the fans get that experience of meeting him, and he treated everybody with such kindness and love and respect. And one thing about Bruno, as long as you showed him the respect that he earned, he would respect you back. And with him, if he said he was going to be there, if he said he was going to do an interview, if he said he was going to be at a personal appearance, then he was. And I was able to even book him probably 2 or 3 times. I did some publicity and marketing for a large sports bar out on Long Island, and I booked him for a few appearances there as well. But I got to know him. Was he a best friend of mine? Probably not, but he knew that I had the respect for him, and he was kind of almost even somebody mentoring me for a little while when a lot of this stuff was going on back in the day. And I even appeared on Phil Donahue with him when they had that show.
Well, you were kind of at that period of time when it was really the WWF having all these scandals, the sex scandals and the steroid scandals. Bruno was in the middle of it. You were in the middle of it because so much of it was happening on your show. And then Bruno had just done Larry King. And here he is now. It's Donahue. It's Dave Meltzer. It's you. It's Bruno. It's Billy Graham. Several other people accusing Vince and the WWF of things. And Vince right there in the middle of it. And, the one bad thing about that period of time is I think if you only knew Bruno from that period of time, you would think here's this angry, bitter guy. And
yes, that's what he came across to the general public. That's what he came across as, some type of bitter old wrestler, and that was unfortunate because he hated what he saw that was going on at the time, and he was very vocal about it. And even the Donahue, I never forget the Donahue experience. I mean, when the Donahue brought Vince in, because they had green rooms, and Vince came, Donahue brought Vince in, to the room where all the people who were going to be talking against what's been going on, and Bruno and Vince didn't even look at each other, and then we were in the green room while the first segment was going on, and I never forget when Vince and Murray Hotchkiss were going at it in that first segment, and it was like Vince was saying some things, and that you just feel the tension in that room. But it was an interesting time. It really was. But Bruno, unfortunately, as some of us did, I mean, even me, I mean, you didn't come off looking that good on a show like that,
It's hard for anybody to come off looking good in a situation like that.
Yeah, very, very, very ugly time in the history of pro wrestling, and I was right in the middle of it, and it was a bad time back then.
Well, let's go back to a different time. You brought up Georgianne Macropoulos.
Good time.
Georgianne Orsi. She's had various last names. She was married several times, but
right.
The one steady throughout the Bruno story is Georgianne, because she wasn't just a fan club president; she really was his confidant. She knew everything that was happening.
Yes.
I mean, Bill Watts brought up the fact that a fan club president, that was Georgianne, was the one who tipped off everyone to what Buddy Rogers was planning to do, because she was also Buddy Rogers' fan club president. She's very involved in the Bruno story. So what was it like for you in the mid-'70s to hang out with Georgianne, knowing that she was really, I mean, she was the Bruno connection?
Right. And she was everybody's mom. I mean, she really she really kind of looked out for all of us that were in her little circle. And I was very happy to be one of those people. But yeah, she just adored Bruno, just worshipped the ground he walked on, and even hanging out with her and having, the time with her. And then sometimes even hanging out with Bruno, because there was a bar after the garden shows, everyone stayed at the Edison Hotel. I think it was on 45th between 7th and Broadway, and there was a little bar called the Savoy across the street from the Edison where everybody hung out. And Bruno occasionally would go out and hang out with us, and he'd sit at a table, and Georgianne was there, and it was kind of a really, really cool time that you look at it today, because when you're in a place and there's Bruno Sammartino and there's Andre the Giant at the bar and Lou Albano and some of the others, it was just kind of it was a magical time in a way. It really was. When as you get older, you reminisce and you think about these things. But just being around Bruno was the presence. It was kind of like you didn't want to approach him. You didn't want to, get in his way. You wanted to be polite and respectful and not bother him. And the fact that you were just in the same room, breathing the same air as Bruno Sammartino, it was something very, very special to be a part of. And I'm so happy that I was able to be a part of that back in the 70s and then later on at the end of the 80s and into the 90s with this man.
Were you ever a member of his fan club, either Georgianne's or Mike Modugno's version of the fan club?
I believe I was with Michael Modugno when he had the fan club, and that was after Georgianne. That was after Georgianne. But Mike and Georgianne were best friends anyway. I mean,
right.
They hung out.
It was a whole crew. It was like a clique.
It was a whole little clique. It really was. And it was just kind of 6 or 8 of us and hanging out, at the garden, at the bar upstairs by the bowling alley, and then afterwards going over to the Savoy. And it was a pretty neat time. And even during the convention days when Georgianne was always like, she was kind of an intermediary too. Like if Bruno was unhappy about something, he would tell Georgianne, and then Georgianne would relay the message. Like even the Buddy Rogers, the Buddy when I booked Buddy for the convention in 1991, the Weekend of Champions, and it was Georgianne who kind of orchestrated that photograph with Bruno and Buddy together, and that picture is kind of historic now.
You say orchestrated. There was no one else who can get them in the same room within 2 feet of each other. She was the only one.
She probably begged them. She let her beg both of them. Please. Yeah. Please, guys,
It's the most tense handshake photo you've ever seen.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. Yes, it was. It was. And you know what? The whole sad part about it is I wasn't in the room when that picture got taken. I don't know who took it, but I would have just loved to just be there just to see them together, and they kind of avoided each other the whole those 2 days.
They avoided each other
for decades, forever. Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me ask you this, because you also have a very unique perspective, because you got to see Bruno from ringside when you were shooting photos. What was that like? What's it like being at ringside at Madison Square Garden when Bruno jogs to the ring?
It's electric. First and foremost, it's electric. You get goosebumps, and I get goosebumps right now just thinking about it. Because whether it was Waldo Von Erich or Killer Kowalski or Nikolai Volkov or Billy Graham or Ken Patera, every time Bruno jogged down to that ring with Skolin, it was just magical. But you also had to be very aware of your surroundings, because there were times where, they tumble out of the ring, and a lot of times they tumble out on the photographers because there were commissioners at ringside on the other sides of the ring, and then the entrance. So I think I got nailed by Bruno once. He fell on me at one time, but yeah, you had to have you had wits about you and just be aware of your surroundings. But inside the ring, it was just electric. It was almost magical. You almost like, you just almost like you're not even there. You're there, but you're not, and it's really kind of ironic, because just recently I started taking a look at all those photographs, and especially this week after this happened and found out that he passed, just to see the pictures that I shot of in the dressing room of him and Andre together, and just all the photographs. I shot photos of Bruno at ringside, not just at the Garden, but in Boston, where I went to college, and I'd shoot ringside there, and those were some matches that were even better than Madison Square Garden. I never forget the time that It was the first time Bruno had gotten pinned. It was a tag team match. It was Graham had just come into the territory and really heated it up, and it was Graham and Spiro Sarion against Bruno and Gorilla Monsoon, or Bruno and Dominic DiNucci, and Graham got the 1-2-3 on him there, you know, and that was a pictures that I sold to Apter or Napolitano or Ring Magazine or something. But yeah. I shoot Bruno like everywhere, you know, and he was it was just amazing. It was an amazing time, and his presence was unlike any other performer that I'd ever seen, with the type of love that he got in that ring that was so genuine by the fans.
How would you compare him to other New York sports celebrities or sports stars of the 60s and 70s? I mean, we had so many up here, from Joe Namath to Mickey Mantle to the entire 69 Mets. But you got... well, I mean, the comparison is kind of sad in a way, because a lot of people didn't want to admit they were wrestling fans, but everybody knew who Bruno Sammartino was. But so, I mean, I think the love that he's getting this week after he's passed, where kind of everyone is kind of paying tribute to him, he had fans everywhere. Everybody knew who he was, but it wasn't cool to say you loved pro wrestling or loved Bruno Sammartino back in the day, where Mickey Mantle and all the other great legends, Joe Namath, all the New York sports legends, it was always out in the open. But Bruno was almost kind of a secret, and I was kind of sad in a way. Before we wrap up, I have to ask you, you got to watch Bruno for so many years. Who's your favorite Bruno opponent? What's your favorite feud? Any favorite matches of yours?
Koloff has to be near the top, just because they had such a long-lasting feud from the beginning of the 70s right through, you know, when Bruno retired. And it was just kind of they loved working with each other. Kowalski was another one. I used to love watching Kowalski work with Bruno. And then, you know, one of the biggest matches, at least for me personally, because I was a huge Spiro Sarion fan, when Spiros turned heel and then he got to face Bruno, that was kind of my personal dream match, and it didn't let me down. There was a lot of heat. There was a lot of heat, and it was believable, and it was magic to see him against some of these guys.
As we begin to close out the show, John, there was one more person I wanted to speak to this week, and that was Kevin Sullivan, who's a very popular guest here on the show. But of course, before he was the Taskmaster, before he was the Games Master, before his turn to the dark side, Kevin worked for the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. He grew up in Boston, and then he got to return to Boston, as well as New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and everywhere else. But I wanted to know what he remembered about working on those shows as an underneath babyface when Bruno Sammartino was still the biggest wrestling star in the world, especially in the Northeast. Let's go to this conversation right now with Kevin Sullivan. As we continue our look at the life and career of Bruno Sammartino, I am happy to welcome back to the Superpodcast one of our all-time most popular guests, and that, of course, is Boston's own Kevin Sullivan. Kevin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's great to be here, and it's a sad reason to be here, but I would really like to put my condolences out there to the Sammartino family. I know it's been overused, the thing about one of a kind, but he was.
You know, I said it at the top here that, you know, before we started recording, I said to you that it's funny, you're from New England. It's one of the things that everyone points to about you. Yet I don't think of you as a Northeast wrestler because you did so much in the South, so much in Florida. But you did indeed come out of the Northeast and you got to wrestle for the WWF for a good while. So what was it like to be around Bruno?
Well, I've seen most of the great champions. You know, I didn't work with, but I go back on television. I saw Buddy Rogers. I actually worked in a 6-man tag match with Lou Thez, and Jersey Joe Walcott was a special referee when I first broke into the business because I was Mike Graham's tag team partner. And Jack Briscoe, Dory Funk I work with, Terry, and not to put them down at all because they all were remarkable champions. But if I landed from another planet and didn't know anything about professional wrestling, and I watched Bruno walk down the aisle, I would know that he was the world heavyweight champion. The way he carried himself, you can go back when he's working in the ring, how he grabs his nose and pours the sweat off. Now, people always say he wasn't a great technical worker, but for up there, he was a very good technical worker. And when he needed to do those matches, he could do it. Baron Cicluna, we all know Baron, reaching up for the foreign object and making it so obvious, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And cutting corners. But he was a big star at one time. But when guys got there, they wanted a homestead, and they understood when they did that, you went from getting paid well to being an employee. You knew you were giving up something to stay there forever. But I saw him have a match with Bruno because he was in Bruno's clique, and he had an incredible match on television. It was over 15 minutes, and Bruno could do that. But Bruno's thing was he could sell, and he made the comeback with the kick and the punch and, the big slam and the bear hug. And it wasn't as pretty as a Briscoe Funk match, but it certainly did the job. How many sellouts did he have in the Garden? And that's not including Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Toronto, Montreal. He even went to, I remember when he went to San Francisco and had been out there for many, many years, and he sold out the Cow Palace against Ray Stevens. And Ray Stevens he always told me that Ray Stevens was the greatest worker in the business. And they came for a finish where Bruno got counted out. And out there, if you got counted out, you would lose your belt. So there's a big controversy for a while that looked like Ray was the champion, but then it fell back. They worked it very well. That the WWW, 3 Ws at the time, F, didn't recognize it because they said it was sanctioned under WWF rules, which I thought was a brilliant idea for the time. So, he was a given guy, too, in the ring. And I was lucky enough, my job was to prepare the guy for Bruno. I would get some wins around. I would beat the big stars that were leaving. And then I would put a Hansen over, or a Brody over, or a Koloff over, or a superstar Billy Graham. So I got to really watch Bruno's work. And one thing about Bruno, we all fall into patterns when we work. I guess we're comfortable in it, or maybe we are afraid to take a chance. But Bruno's work with guys completely different. He work with superstar completely different than he would work against a guy like Killer Kowalski. So I just thought he was, in the last few years, as time goes by and we get further and further away from his era, I don't think maybe that some of the younger fans give him his due. And the other thing was, it was more ethnicity meant a lot more back in the day. And all the Italians would come to the Gardens. They would live and die with Bruno. If you went down to East Boston in everybody's living room wall, there's a picture of the Pope and a picture of Bruno. So I think he, maybe because of his strife with the WWE up until a few years ago, he didn't get his recognition now to the newer fans that haven't seen him. But if you want to go back into time and go back into easier days, you'll get a real enjoyment watching Bruno.
Yeah, there were so many ethnic stars back in the day, and just look at New York. Antonino Rocca, major ethnic star. After Bruno's first run, Pedro Morales, big ethnic star. But Bruno, I think, is clearly the biggest ethnic star of all time, just because of how he crossed over into those communities in towns like New York, in towns like Boston, in towns like Philadelphia, etc.
Yeah, I think, I'll go with this. Rocca had two ethnic groups that really followed him. One, the Italians. The second one were the Hispanics because he was from Argentina and he spoke Spanish. But the Italians didn't get behind him like they did Bruno. They were behind him, but not like Bruno. You brought up a great point there. That everybody lived and died with, every Italian lived and died with Bruno. And back in the day, I mean, Vince, who was an Irish guy on the card. There was an Italian guy on the card. There'd be a Polak on the card. I mean, Putski, Native American. They even used Carlos Rocha.
That's right.
Portuguese.
That's right, yeah.
I mean, so they used a lot of ethnicity, and the old man didn't miss a beat with that. And, Blackjack Mulligan was the bad Irish guy, and then Pat Barrett was a good guy. So, I mean, they covered their bases pretty well.
Let me ask you about being in the locker room with Bruno, because, the interesting thing is here you have this guy who almost instantly, as soon as he begins wrestling, becomes a major attraction in New York. He gets blackballed, becomes a major attraction in Toronto, comes back, and then the Bruno legend is cemented. So, he's on top for so many years. And I guess one of the things you really have to give him credit for is his mentality, because let's say Rocca, if it was Rocca with that kind of run, he wouldn't have been able to handle it. Bruno was the right guy to get that kind of run and to have that kind of push in terms of his capacity to manage it mentally. But what was he like in the locker room? I mean, you've been around a lot of world champions. When you're in the locker room with Bruno, what's that like?
Well, I mean, you're in awe of him because of what he's accomplished. But Brian, you just said something that I never even thought about. Nobody else could have done it but him. He was the right guy at the right time with the right, and this is the word I'm going to use, and hopefully some young wrestlers are listening to this, the work ethic.
Yeah.
There was never a time he was out of shape. You couldn't blow him up. And believe me, his matches, Kowalski was a machine. You know what I mean? He just kept on going and going and going. And I mean, some of the few times that they ever had 4 matches, we were talking earlier, Bill Watts got 4 matches in the Garden with Bruno. So did Kowalski. And, so he was able to work with everybody, but his work ethic was spot on. And the other thing about Bruno, if you had a problem about your money, if you thought, we'll say back in the day, you got $300 and you thought the house was up and you were on his house and you thought you got $350, you could go to Bruno and say, hey, Bruno, last time I was on the show, I was on the 3rd match and I got $300, and this time I was in a match with Hansen or Brody or Superstar, and I put them over because you're going to work with them next time, and the house is bigger. I think I deserve money. And he would go and ask for more money for you. And not many guys on top would have ever done that. You know what I mean?
He handled responsibility. I mean, that's the thing. There aren't too many guys that were that responsible to be in that top role.
Right. And he was a very honorable guy. And he understood, too, that everybody worked hard. And he did understand that he was reaping a huge reward because up until that time, I'm not so sure all the champions were getting a fair count. But Bruno got his money because he had a flat fee plus a percentage. So it actually could have put him in a bad light to go and ask for a Johnny Rods or a Pete Sanchez to get another $100 for the night. You know what I mean? And he was the guy that, like you said, he was the right guy to carry the torch. and he was the right guy in the dressing room. So, I questioned him on a couple of things. One of the things I remember questioning him, back in the day there, they used to have the world title match, their title match, on early, right?
Yeah, before intermission.
Yeah. And they put me and Sanchez on afterwards. And I went right to him and I said, hey, I've been busting my ass just like everybody else here. And this is a big show. And I'm going to go out in a babyface match against Sanchez after you just work with Ivan Koloff. I said, this isn't going to fly. And he said, well, they didn't change the match, but at least he understood. And I think he appreciated that I was starting to learn the business. So, yeah, he was, you brought that up again, and I keep on going back to it. He was the right guy, the right time for a long time. But not to get big-headed or whatever, but he was. The work ethic, he was there every night. He had to be.
Well, you were there in 76. I don't think you were on the Garden show when he broke his neck, but I know you were on the Shea Stadium undercard when 2 months later they rushed him out of the hospital to fight Stan Hansen at Shea Stadium. What do you remember about that period of time when Bruno broke his neck?
Well, I knew when Bruno's, funny that you said that. I saw Hansen about 2 weeks ago, and we were at a show together. We went out that night and we were talking, and he said, boy, he felt horrible when he dropped Bruno on his head. But when he went to the ring, Hansen that night, I didn't think he was going to get to the ring because you could feel the vibes from the people. They were so hot. And then after he put Bruno over, it was almost that the vibes got worse. They started throwing things, because the guy had lost. So it was very, very, very intense. But the people believed in Bruno so much, and they felt that this guy had created the biggest injustice, meaning Hansen, what he did to Bruno. So it was huge.
I think sometimes Bob Backlund gets unfairly maligned because he followed Bruno. And, Bruno was still being used in kind of the main event spot on a lot of those early Bob Backlund title defenses, but it raises a problem. How do you follow someone like that? I mean, you've been a booker. When you have a guy who's that magnitude of a star for so many years, for an entire generation, how do you build after that?
I think, and I love Bob Backlund. I've worked with him a bunch. I love him. He's a great guy. But I think at the time, they should have given Superstar Billy Graham a run and turned him babyface against Koloff and pushed Bob's title reign back maybe 2 years and then give Bob the rub where someone could beat Backlund like they do up there. They used to do quite a bit, the interim champions, you know what I mean? The Koloffs and the Stasiaks, right. Because they just made it harder on Bob because Superstar Billy Graham was over so big that I think, it made it harder on Bob to draw. And, you said that Bruno was on the card. It wasn't just Bruno being on the card. Dusty and Superstar will be in a Texas death match or a strap match or return match. They had Pedro working still. They had Jimmy Snooker and Morocco hot as firecracker. They brought Buddy Rogers back to be a manager. They built everything around Bob so he couldn't fail. And I'm not saying that he would have failed. I'm just saying that's a tough act to follow. But they had Superstar Billy Graham, who was 180 degrees away from Bruno. Now you bring in a guy that's a similar technician, much smaller than Bruno, the first non-ethnic champion, or guy on top up there. He's from the Midwest, a good-looking young boy, but That's the word it was. He was a young boy. It wasn't a sizzly veterans that they had up there. And I think if they had given Superstar the run with Koloff and then had some heel beat him and then Bob come up and beat him, because, they had Bob on TV for 14 months before he ever appeared on a live event. Did you know that?
Yeah, he only did TVs, and he was still working in Florida, I think.
Yeah, and I think he went up to Minneapolis too, but 14 months, that's a lot of time and invested. And that tells me, this is just my opinion, that tells me, first of all, they want to make sure he was going to draw. But they did have trepidations that he wasn't going to draw without a big sideshow around him. I mean, think, you guys on TV over a year and you don't bring him in. And that's something maligning Bob. I just think that the timing wasn't right. I think Bob would have been a huge star if he beat the guy that actually beat Superstar Billy Graham rather than him beating Superstar Billy Graham, because I think back in some of the people's heads, especially the Italians, they kind of didn't say, oh, he beat the guy that beat Bruno. They were saying, he beat the guy that beat Bruno. Do you know what I mean?
That's interesting.
It was like
yeah.
I mean, I did one time take psychology, and there is a thing, it's that passive aggressive thing where, oh yeah, that's good, but and I've thought about that, about how the Italians took that, because he wasn't one of theirs. They had, and I often thought about this. When he beat Superstar, if Bob had gone and learned, all he had to learn is 2 sentences in Italian. I did this for Bruno in Italian, and I think
oh my God, he would have been over.
I think it would have, yeah, where, but hindsight's 20/20. But yeah, we certainly are going. I know when people told me that Bruno died, I thought he'd go on forever.
Well, what about in '89 when you're on the booking committee? You guys used him at Halloween Havoc '89 as the special, I don't know if it was referee or enforcer for that cage match with Muta and Funk versus Flair and Sting. What do you remember about bringing Bruno back to Philadelphia that night?
Well, I knew it'd be huge. And Bruno, actually, that was when he had the heat with the office in New York and really jumped at the chance to come back. And again, he was a presence in the dressing room. Everybody came in to see him. It was like kissing the Pope's ring. I mean, he was even the other guys that were champions who came to see Bruno and paid their respects, and he just had this aura about him that he was bigger than life.
Well, there it is, Kevin Sullivan, and that concludes our look at the life and career of Bruno Sammartino. John, it really is interesting. I brought up earlier the comparison to other Northeast sports celebrities or New York sports celebrities like Mickey Mantle, let's say Walt Clyde Frazier. I always thought of Bruno in that class of athlete, but the one difference is the way Bruno conducted himself is kind of the way you would think every athlete should conduct themselves, and none of them do. The way of handling himself with integrity and dignity, never really doing anything that would be seen as disrespectful in front of the fans, never saying anything, never cursing in front of the fans, never drinking in front of fans. There really aren't too many athletes or too many celebrities that I could ever think of who behaved with the class that Bruno Sammartino did.
No, I can't either. A good comparison might be someone like Joe DiMaggio, who, there's DiMaggio stories out there, but he was always, on that pedestal to New York fans, and, his face stayed around. He was on WPIX working for the Yankees, and then he did the Mr. Coffee commercials, and, he was looked on as, like I said, he was on that pedestal, and Bruno was like that as well.
Bruno did not have Mr. Coffee, but he did have Bally's in Atlantic City. Yes, we're actually, now that I think of it, it's him, Willie Mays, and Walt Clyde Frazier, and Bobby Orr or whoever else was there, I forget. But they're all dancing and having a great time in tuxedos in Atlantic City. Go to YouTube if you don't know what I'm talking about. Just put Bally's Bruno Sammartino, and you get to see him and various other celebrities and sports stars dancing. But anyway, we're not going to end on that note, John. John, as we begin to wrap things up, anything we didn't touch on, anything you want to talk about Bruno's career that we did not already hit on?
There's one thing, and that is, I believe it was either the end of 1984 or the beginning of 1985. The main event at Madison Square Garden, and when I say the main event, it was the thing positioned highest on the card that drew the crowd, was a Piper's Pit with Bruno Sammartino. And you had people, this is how over Bruno was, and how over Piper was as well. People were paying money, $12 of 1985 money, to go see Bruno Sammartino kind of bicker with Roddy Piper in the middle of the ring, and you knew deep down that it wasn't just going to end there, that these two were going to get at it, and that's what the people wanted to see, and it just speaks volumes, again, to what an incredible draw Bruno Sammartino was.
And they hung on his every word. I mean, look, it's Roddy Piper. You listen to what he says, but Bruno being there with Piper had that dynamic, because here's the old school, here's the old world, and here's this whole new breed of wrestler that we've never seen before in the Northeast.
Yeah, Bruno was not exactly rockin' wrestling, but he was wrestling. He was Bruno Sammartino.
He was wrestling. I said it on the Cornette Show. I hate these Mount Rushmore questions because it's really hard to do, and who says that 4 should be the number? But if you're going to do it, if you really are going to do it, Bruno has to be one of the 4. He has to, because no one has the longevity. No one had the popularity, the drawing card. Everywhere he went, he was a major star. There's no other star in wrestling history quite like Bruno Sammartino. And quite frankly, we probably didn't do enough on this show to talk about him, but hopefully you have enjoyed what you have heard this week. The 605 Super Podcast is a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. For John McAdam, I'm the great Brian Last. Tally-ho!